Picture a city of breathtaking grandeur, its towering walls adorned with colossal stone guardians, the heart of an empire so powerful its name alone could make rival kingdoms tremble. Now, imagine that city utterly destroyed, its palaces reduced to dust, its very memory swallowed by the desert for centuries. This was the fate of Nineveh, the magnificent capital of the Assyrian Empire. But beneath those silent, sun-baked mounds lay a secret far more valuable than any hoard of gold, a secret that would only be revealed when a man's relentless curiosity met the patience of the earth. This is the story of the world's first great library, a treasure trove of knowledge deliberately assembled and then catastrophically lost, only to be miraculously resurrected in the modern age, forcing us to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the dawn of civilization. It's a tale that connects us directly to the minds of people who lived nearly 3,000 years ago, a conversation across millennia written not on paper, but on fragile tablets of clay. The driving force behind this incredible repository was a king unlike any other. Ashurbanipal, the last great ruler of Assyria, was a paradox, a fearsome warrior king who was also a deeply literate scholar, a man who commanded armies but whose personal passion was the collection of knowledge. From the farthest reaches of his empire, from the ancient cities of Babylonia to the lands of Egypt, he sent his scribes on a monumental mission to gather every significant text they could find. His decree created a universal library, a single place housing the entire intellectual universe of Mesopotamia. Think of the ambition behind that act, the desire to corral all of human understanding, every epic poem, every medical prescription, every star chart, every royal decree into the rooms of his palace. This wasn't just a collection, it was an attempt to capture the very soul of a civilization, to build a fortress for wisdom itself. What we discovered when this library was finally unearthed was beyond anyone's wildest dreams. It wasn't merely an administrative archive, it was a window into a world we had only guessed at. The fire that consumed Nineveh during its final, violent collapse in 612 BC paradoxically baked and preserved these clay tablets, sealing them in a time capsule for over 2 millennia. When archaeologists finally broke through to those buried rooms, they found the crown jewels of ancient literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its haunting flood narrative that predates the story of Noah. They found sophisticated medical texts diagnosing diseases and detailing complex herbal remedies. They found the inner thoughts of kings, the fears of priests, and the meticulous work of countless anonymous scribes. This video is your guided journey into that astonishing discovery. We will walk through the dramatic excavations, feel the thrill of deciphering a lost language, and explore the profound ways this single library has reshaped our understanding of history, religion, and the very origins of human knowledge. So, let's begin peeling back the layers of sand and time to reveal the secrets buried for centuries beneath the sands of Nineveh. To understand the incredible treasure that was the library, we first need to step back and grasp the sheer, overwhelming power of the civilization that built it. This was not a quiet, scholarly culture tucked away in some isolated corner of the world. The Assyrian Empire was, for its time, the most formidable military and political force the Near East had ever seen. Its heart was a relentless war machine, and its influence stretched from the sparkling waters of the Mediterranean to the rugged peaks of modern-day Iran. At its zenith, this was an empire built on iron, discipline, and an unshakable belief in its own destiny to rule the known world. Kings like the formidable Sennacherib, who bragged of leveling entire cities and diverting rivers to crush his enemies, set a precedent of absolute power. They didn't just conquer, they sought to annihilate and rebuild, erasing the identities of conquered peoples and absorbing their wealth, their gods, and crucially, their knowledge into the ever-growing Assyrian sphere. This drive to control everything land, people, and information created the perfect conditions for a project as ambitious as a universal library. At the center of this sprawling empire lay its crown jewel, the capital city of Nineveh. Situated on the eastern bank of the mighty Tigris River, its location was a masterstroke of strategy and economics. The river provided a vital artery for trade and communication, while the fertile plains surrounding the city could support a massive population. But Nineveh was far more than just a well-placed fortress. Under the Assyrian kings, it was transformed into a metropolis of almost mythical grandeur. Imagine approaching its walls, which were so massive that two chariots could ride abreast on their top. Enormous, intricately carved stone guardians, winged bulls and lions with human heads known as lamashu stood watch at the grand gateways, their expressions both serene and intimidating, designed to project absolute authority and divine protection. Within these walls, the kings built breathtaking palaces, their halls lined with magnificent stone reliefs depicting royal lion hunts, triumphant battles, and religious processions. These weren't just decorations, they were a form of imperial propaganda, a constant visual reminder of the king's power, piety, and his role as the guardian of cosmic order. This cultural sophistication, however, was funded by and intertwined with a policy of ruthless expansion. The Assyrian army was a professional, highly organized force, pioneering the use of iron weaponry and complex siege tactics that made their city walls seem almost invincible. When a region rebelled or a new territory was targeted, the response was often swift and terrifyingly brutal. The Assyrians perfected psychological warfare, publicizing their cruelties in annals and on those very palace reliefs to discourage future defiance. They would deport entire populations, scattering them across the empire to break their cultural bonds and exploit their labor elsewhere. Yet, amidst this calculated terror, there existed a profound intellectual curiosity. The Assyrians understood that to govern such a vast and diverse empire, they needed more than just soldiers. They needed administrators, astronomers, doctors, and priests. They systematically looted the intellectual treasures of the civilizations they subdued: clay tablets from the great scholarly centers of Babylonia, medical texts from Egypt, and scientific observations from every corner of their domain. This collecting wasn't merely plunder, it was a strategic consolidation of knowledge, a way to centralize all useful and divine information in the hands of the state. The empire's relentless growth fed its hunger for knowledge, and its capital, Nineveh, became the logical, indeed the only possible, place to store it all. But what kind of man would conceive of such a grand intellectual project in the heart of a warrior empire? The answer lies with its last great ruler, Ashurbanipal, a king who shattered the mold. While his predecessors were celebrated for their prowess on the battlefield, Ashurbanipal's legacy is doubly profound because he was a scholar king, a man just as comfortable in the quiet scriptorium as he was on a thundering war chariot. His own inscriptions boast of a royal education unlike any other, where he mastered the intricate cuneiform script of both his native Akkadian and the more ancient scholarly Sumerian language. He didn't just learn to read, he was trained in the complex arts of mathematics, the elaborate rituals of oil and liver divination, and the vast poetic literature of his culture. This was not a prince receiving a superficial education. He claimed, and there's little reason to doubt him, to have achieved genuine scribal proficiency, a skill almost unheard of for a monarch destined for the throne. This deep, personal literacy forged within him a unique appreciation for the power of the written word, transforming him from a mere consumer of knowledge into its most passionate patron. This personal passion directly fueled a royal command of staggering ambition. From his palace in Nineveh, Ashurbanipal issued a decree that effectively launched the world's first state-sponsored intellectual dragnet. He dispatched his scribes and agents to every corner of the empire, but with a special focus on the ancient, revered cities of Babylonia, which were considered the wellspring of Mesopotamian learning. His instructions were breathtakingly comprehensive. Seek out every important text, from the oldest tablets stored in crumbling temples to the latest works in private collections. He wanted everything: epic poetry, medical handbooks, grammatical lists, royal correspondence, astronomical observations, and especially the vast collections of Omen texts that were believed to predict the future. He wasn't just plundering. His letters specifically command his agents to carefully copy the originals and to collate different versions of the same text to create a definitive, authoritative edition. This was a systematic, scholarly effort to centralize the entire intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia, creating a single, universal repository of all known wisdom. It was an act of cultural imperialism, yes, but also one of profound preservation. What truly sets Ashurbanipal apart from every other conqueror of the ancient world is that this was not a detached administrative order. The library was his personal obsession. We know this because of the intimate colophons, the scribble signatures, found on many of the tablets. Some bear phrases like, "I, Ashurbanipal, king of the universe, king of Assyria, on whom the gods bestowed vast intelligence. I wrote this tablet in the assembly of the scribes." Whether he physically inscribed every word himself is less important than the statement it makes. This king saw himself as an active participant in the scholarly process. He didn't just want to own the knowledge, he wanted to understand it, to engage with it, to be a part of its lineage. While other kings might have collected texts as trophies of conquest, Ashurbanipal collected them as tools for understanding the cosmos, for governing more effectively, and for securing his own legacy. He understood that true power wasn't just controlling land and armies, but also controlling the accumulated knowledge of his age. This deeply personal drive, this fusion of a king's authority with a scholar's curiosity, is the human spark that ignited the creation of the greatest library the world had ever known. Stepping into the North Palace of Ashurbanipal, you would have entered a space that was the intellectual engine room of the entire empire. This was no dusty archive tucked away in a forgotten corner. The library was integrated into the very heart of royal power, a clear signal that knowledge was a core pillar of Assyrian rule. Archaeologists believe it was housed in a series of interconnected rooms, their walls lined with shelves made of wood and reed. And on these shelves, and stored in countless baskets and clay pots, rested the true wealth of Assyria, tens of thousands of clay tablets. Imagine the sheer physical presence of this collection. Each tablet, whether a small palm-sized note or a large, multi-columned masterpiece, had significant weight. The collective mass of this stored information was literally tons of fired clay, a library you could feel in your muscles as much as in your mind. This was a place of constant activity where scribes moved between the shelves, retrieving specific texts for royal consultation, administrative reference, or the vital work of copying and adding to the collection. The organization of this vast repository was remarkably sophisticated, a testament to the Assyrian love for order. Tablets weren't just piled haphazardly. They were often grouped by subject matter, all the medical texts together, all the astronomical omens in another section. To make finding a specific work easier, many of the storage containers had small clay labels attached to them. Think of these as the world's first library catalog cards. These tags might identify a series of tablets, for instance, as tablets of the series when the exorcist goes to the house of a sick person, directing a scholar directly to the relevant medical incantations. For especially long literary works like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which spanned 12 tablets, each individual piece was numbered, ensuring the epic could be read in its proper sequence. This meticulous system transformed a mountain of clay into a navigable and functional resource, allowing for the efficient retrieval of information that was crucial for everything from diagnosing an illness to interpreting a celestial omen for the king. Now, let's open some of those virtual drawers and explore the breathtaking scope of what was collected. This was a true universal library, aiming to encapsulate every branch of human knowledge as the Assyrians understood it. In one basket, you'd find the foundational myths of civilization, like the magnificent Epic of Gilgamesh, with its profound meditations on friendship, mortality, and the quest for eternal life. In another, there were religious texts, hymns praising the gods, prayers for protection, and detailed descriptions of complex rituals. The scientific and medical sections were vast. Medical tablets provided diagnoses for diseases and listed detailed prescriptions, combining herbal remedies with spiritual incantations, revealing a holistic view of health. Astronomical tablets recorded the movements of planets and stars, not for pure science, but to read the will of the gods in the night sky, believing celestial events foretold the fate of the kingdom. Then there were the practical texts, law codes establishing justice, treaties with foreign powers, and endless administrative records detailing everything from tax collections to the distribution of rations to palace workers. This combination of the profoundly spiritual and the mundanely practical shows that the library served both the soul of the empire and its day-to-day machinery. The linguistic landscape of the library was as diverse as its subject matter. While the primary language was Akkadian, written in the intricate cuneiform script, it was not the only one. The collection preserved the even more ancient Sumerian language, which had ceased to be a spoken tongue centuries earlier but remained the Latin of Mesopotamia, the essential language of scholarship, religion, and law. Scribes were trained to read and write in both, and many tablets are bilingual, with Sumerian columns alongside their Akkadian translations. This was a conscious act of preserving a cultural heritage that the Assyrians saw as their own foundation. Furthermore, there were texts in other languages of the region, evidence of the far-reaching net cast by Ashurbanipal's agents. This multilingual environment underscores that the library was not an insular, Assyrian-only project. It was a truly cosmopolitan center of learning that recognized and incorporated the wisdom of all the conquered peoples, making Nineveh the central clearinghouse for the intellectual capital of the entire ancient Near East. All of this was made possible by the relentless, meticulous work of the scribes. They were the unsung heroes, the human processors who transformed the king's ambition into a tangible reality. Their work went far beyond simple copying. They were editors, translators, and curators. When a new text arrived from a distant city, a scribe would carefully check it for errors, compare it with other versions in the collection to create the most accurate text possible, and then produce a pristine new copy for the library's shelves. We know they took great pride in their work. At the end of many tablets, they would inscribe a colophon, a scribble signature. This note might give the name of the scribe, the source of the original text, and even a line praising the quality of their copy. Some colophons included a fierce warning, a curse against anyone who would later damage or steal the tablet. This practice gives us a deeply human connection to these anonymous figures. They weren't just clerks but guardians of knowledge, understanding the immense value of what they were preserving. The Great Library of Nineveh was therefore a living, breathing institution, a hub of intellectual activity that buzzed with the quiet, focused energy of scholars dedicated to the monumental task of gathering all the world's knowledge under one royal roof. Yet for all its grandeur and power, the mighty Assyrian Empire was not destined to last forever. The very tactics that built its dominion, ruthless suppression, mass deportations, and heavy-handed rule, planted the seeds of its eventual destruction. Resentment simmered across the conquered territories, and a powerful coalition began to form, united by a single, burning goal: to wipe Nineveh from the face of the earth. The final act began in the year 612 BC, when the combined armies of the Babylonians, the Medes from the Iranian plateau, and other former vassals marched on the seemingly impregnable capital. They laid siege to the great city, its massive walls now a prison for those inside. Ancient accounts describe a brutal, months-long struggle, with the attackers eventually exploiting a dramatic rise in the Tigris River that may have undermined sections of the fortifications. The defenses were breached, and the enemy poured into the streets of the magnificent city. What followed was an orgy of destruction meticulously documented by the victors. The Babylonian chronicles, a terse but authoritative record, simply state that the city was taken and a great defeat was inflicted upon the Assyrians. But we can reconstruct the scene from other sources and from the archaeological evidence left behind. Imagine the terror and chaos of those final days and hours. The grand processional avenues, once reserved for royal parades, became bloody battlegrounds. The magnificent palaces built by Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal were systematically looted and then set ablaze. The very air would have been thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. The colossal Lamashu statues, those majestic guardians of the gateways, were toppled and defaced, their power broken by the conquerors' hammers. This was not merely a military conquest, it was a deliberate, symbolic annihilation. The coalition sought to erase Assyria's cultural and political identity to ensure it could never rise again. In the heart of this maelstrom was the North Palace, and within it the Great Library. As the fires raged through the royal quarters, the wooden shelves and storage baskets holding the library's collection became fuel for an inferno. The heat was so intense that it vitrified the mud-brick walls and caused the very limestone slabs of the reliefs to crack and spall. For the thousands of clay tablets housed within, this fire should have been their final end. But in a stunning twist of fate, the catastrophe that sought to destroy them became the very agent of their salvation. The intense heat of the burning palace acted like a giant, if uneven, kiln. It baked the clay tablets, which were typically just sun-dried for everyday use, transforming them into a much more durable, ceramic-like material. Then, as the upper stories and roofs of the palace, constructed from mud-brick and timber, collapsed inward, they buried the rooms in a dense, protective layer of rubble. This enormous blanket of debris sealed the tablets away, sheltering them from rain, wind, and the trampling feet of subsequent generations. It is one of history's greatest ironies. The violent sack of the city, which was intended to extinguish Assyrian culture forever, instead fossilized its intellectual heart. The library was not simply lost, it was intentionally entombed by the process of its own destruction. While the city above was abandoned and slowly eroded into a series of anonymous mounds, the library rested safely below, a perfectly preserved time capsule. The knowledge that Ashurbanipal had so carefully gathered was saved from the slow decay that would have certainly consumed sun-dried clay over the centuries. The same event that shattered an empire and scattered its people also guaranteed that its voice would not be silenced. but merely paused, waiting patiently under the accumulating sand for a future age to listen. For the next 2,500 years, the Great Library slept, its secrets hidden beneath the very ruins that marked the utter finality of its civilization's fall. For centuries, the Great Library slept beneath the earth, its existence fading into myth and legend, remembered only in a few cryptic passages of the Bible and the fragmented histories of classical authors. The local inhabitants of the region, living in the shadow of the great mounds they called Kyanjik and Nebai Yunus, had no idea they were walking atop the ruins of a once great capital. That all changed in the middle of the 19th century, a period of burgeoning European fascination with the Orient, when a new kind of adventurer arrived on the scene, the archaeologist. And few were as daring, ambitious, or charismatic as the young Englishman Austen Henry Layard. With little more than intuition, immense personal drive, and a modest budget from the British Museum, Layard would become the man who first tore the veil from ancient Nineveh. His journey to the Near East reads like something from a Victorian novel. Initially setting out to become a diplomat, he found himself utterly captivated by the landscape and its mysterious, man-made hills which local tradition hinted concealed lost cities. He was convinced that the largest of these mounds, Kyanjik, opposite the modern city of Mosul, was the key to unlocking a forgotten world. In 1845, with official permission finally secured, he marshaled a team of local workers and with almost breathtaking speed began to dig. Layard's excavation methods were a product of their time, driven by a race for spectacular finds rather than meticulous scientific recording. He was not a patient, trowel-wielding scholar, but a master of logistics and motivation, employing hundreds of men to dig deep trenches and tunnels straight into the heart of the mound. The goal was to find sculptured stone and precious objects as quickly as possible. This approach was undeniably reckless by modern standards, potentially destroying countless fragile artifacts and the subtle context that tells their story. Yet it yielded almost immediate and staggering results. Just days into the dig, his workers hit upon a wall, and then, emerging from the earth, the majestic, silent face of a colossal winged bull. This was a lamashu, a mythical guardian spirit carved from a single, enormous slab of alabaster. The discovery sent a shockwave of excitement through the team, and when news reached Europe, through the intellectual world. These were not mere trinkets, they were the monumental art of a lost empire. As the trenches widened, more wonders emerged. Vast, intricately carved stone panels depicting royal lion hunts, military conquests, and religious ceremonies. Layard was uncovering the throne rooms and ceremonial halls of the Assyrian kings, bringing to light a civilization whose artistic power and grandeur had been utterly forgotten. However, Layard's story is inextricably linked with that of a rival, a man whose contributions were long overshadowed, Hormuzd Rassam. Rassam was a fascinating and complex figure, an Assyrian Christian from Mosul who began his career as Layard's assistant and interpreter. Brilliant and capable, he quickly learned the ropes of archaeology and administration. When Layard eventually moved on to other pursuits and diplomatic posts, it was Rassam who took over the excavations for the British Museum. Their relationship, however, soured into a bitter professional rivalry. Layard, the celebrated public figure, often received the lion's share of the credit, while Rassam, who was responsible for some of the most significant discoveries at Nineveh and other sites, felt his work was minimized and his reputation unfairly tarnished by Layard in official reports. This tension was more than just personal drama. It reflected the complex colonial dynamics of the era, where a native expert's achievements were often filtered through the lens of his European superiors. Despite this, Rassam's persistence and intuitive understanding of the site would prove absolutely critical. for it was under his direction that the true scale of the library's textual treasure began to emerge. While Layard's initial campaigns had uncovered the breathtaking stone sculptures that defined the Assyrian aesthetic for the modern world, they had only grazed the true intellectual wealth of Nineveh. In the final years of his work, and then under Rassam's more systematic, though still rapid, excavations, workers began to encounter rooms that were different. Instead of sculpted walls, they found chambers filled to waist height with a puzzling substance. Broken pieces of clay, many covered in the minute, wedge-shaped markings of cuneiform script. To untrained eyes, these fragments looked like nothing more than piles of ancient pottery shards. Layard himself recognized their importance but was primarily focused on the more visually stunning sculptures. He did, however, ship thousands of these tablet fragments back to the British Museum, where they filled crates and sat waiting for scholars to decipher them. It was a tantalizing glimpse, a clear signal that beyond the stone warriors and royal hunts, Kynjik held a different kind of treasure. Layard's triumphs had revealed the empire's muscle and its art, but the mountains of inscribed clay hinted at its mind, a deep well of knowledge that was only beginning to be tapped, waiting for the next chapter of discovery to bring its words back to life. The scene at the Mound of Kynjik shifted dramatically from the pursuit of monumental sculpture to something far more perplexing. As Hormuzd Rassam directed his teams to dig deeper into the foundations of Ashurbanipal's North Palace, they broke through into a series of low, unadorned chambers that had escaped the worst of the looting that followed the city's fall. Instead of the expected stone reliefs or hidden caches of gold, their shovels and picks met with a strange, crunching resistance. The floors of these rooms were not stone or packed earth, but were literally paved with a thick layer of broken clay. At first glance, it must have looked like the rubble of a collapsed mud brick wall, a disappointing end to a promising trench. But a closer look revealed that nearly every piece of this debris was meticulously inscribed with the precise, wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform. One of Rassam's foremen likely held up a fragment the size of a palm, covered on both sides in a dense, orderly text, and the true nature of the find began to dawn on them. They were not standing in a trash pit, they were standing in a library. The initial confusion quickly gave way to a dawning, staggering awe as the sheer, incomprehensible volume of the material became clear. This was not a few dozen tablets, it was a landslide of text. Workers began carefully, and in the 19th century style, not always carefully enough, filling basket after basket, then crate after crate with these fragile pieces of baked clay. They weren't just on the floor, they were found in layers, often to a depth of a foot or more, the shattered remains of the shelves and storage jars that had once held them. Rassam, in his communications with the British Museum, struggled to convey the magnitude. He wrote of entire rooms packed with them, estimating the find in the tens of thousands of fragments. The number was so vast it was almost meaningless. Imagine the overwhelming sensation of facing a puzzle box containing not hundreds, but thousands of pieces, with no picture on the box to guide you, and every piece made of a material as fragile as pottery. The excitement in the camp was palpable, but it was tempered by a sense of profound responsibility and the sheer, logistical nightmare they now faced. The process of excavating this treasure was a painstaking ballet of brute force and delicate precision. The common laborers hired for their strength had to be constantly supervised and instructed to treat every piece of broken clay as a potential treasure. A fragment that looked like an insignificant shard could be the missing line from a royal epic, the key clause in a treaty, or a unique medical prescription. The tablets had not survived intact. The heat of the palace fire had baked them, but the collapse of the roof and upper stories had also crushed them. Many were broken into multiple pieces, and the fragments from different tablets were hopelessly intermingled. The excavator's task was to gently clear the earth, gather every single inscribed piece, and pack them for their long, perilous journey down the Tigris River, through the Persian Gulf, around the Cape of Good Hope, and finally to the British Museum in London. They were packed in crates padded with straw, like the most precious china, but even with this care, the journey was treacherous, and many tablets arrived in an even more fragmentary state than when they left Nineveh. The emotion of the moment is captured in the field notes and letters that survived. There's a sense of breathless discovery mixed with the sobering realization of the work ahead. One can almost hear the mix of triumph and exhaustion in Rassam's reports as he tallied another crate destined for London. Later, when these crates were opened in the museum, the scholars who first laid eyes on the hall felt a similar dizzying combination of thrill and dread. The pioneer Assyriologist Henry Rawlinson, upon seeing the deluge of fragments, reportedly remarked on the mountain of material that had descended upon them. It was a discovery that simultaneously answered 1,000 questions and asked 10,000 new ones. They had the words, but the language was still only partially understood. They had the stories, but they were scattered across 1,000 shattered pieces. This was not the end of the quest, it was the end of the beginning. The physical discovery of the library was a monumental achievement, but it was merely the prelude to the even greater intellectual adventure of reading it, an endeavor that would require cracking a code that had been silent for millennia. So, with tens of thousands of clay fragments arriving in London and other European capitals, scholars faced a wall of silence. These weren't just broken pieces of pottery, they were books whose language no one had spoken for over 2,000 years. The wedge-shaped cuneiform script covering the tablets like intricate bird tracks was a complete mystery. Cracking this code was a challenge on par with deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, but with one significant difference: there was no single, neat equivalent to the Rosetta Stone, no known bilingual text that offered a direct translation. The scholars were starting from absolute zero, and the task before them was one of the greatest intellectual detective stories in history. The key that would finally unlock this ancient language wasn't found in the library of Nineveh itself, but hundreds of miles away, carved into a sheer, inaccessible cliff face in modern-day Iran. This is the story of the Behistun inscription and the man who dared to scale a mountain to read it, Henry Rawlinson. Rawlinson was a British Army officer, a diplomat, and an adventurer with a brilliant mind for languages. Stationed in Persia, he became fascinated by a massive rock relief high on the face of Mount Behistun. This wasn't just any carving, it was a proclamation by the Persian king Darius the Great, celebrating his victories, and it was inscribed in 3 different cuneiform scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The Old Persian version used a relatively simple alphabetic cuneiform with only about 40 signs, while the Babylonian version used the far more complex system with hundreds of signs, which was the direct ancestor of the script used in Ashurbanipal's library. Rawlinson realized that if he could decipher the simpler Old Persian first, it could provide the key to understanding the Babylonian, and from there, the entire Akkadian language of the Assyrians. The problem was the inscription's location. It was carved more than 300 feet up a sheer cliff, a place so dangerous that local legend held that the sculptor himself had been left there to die so the secret of its creation would perish with him. Undeterred, Rawlinson risked his life repeatedly over the course of years, using ladders, ropes, and even trusting his balance on the narrowest of rock ledges to carefully copy every single sign onto paper. He dangled precariously over the abyss, his notebook in hand, creating a precise facsimile of the text that would become the foundation for deciphering an entire civilization. The process of decipherment was a meticulous, step-by-step puzzle. Scholars, including Rawlinson and his contemporaries like the Irish clergyman Edward Hincks, started with the Old Persian section. They began by identifying a single, repeating word that appeared in a prominent position, which they correctly guessed was the royal title, king. From there, they looked for the pattern of a king's name, and by comparing the cuneiform signs with known royal names from later Persian history, they slowly began to assign sound values to the individual wedges. It was like hearing the first faint clicks of a gigantic combination lock starting to turn. Once they had a basic understanding of Old Persian, they could turn to the Babylonian columns of the Behistun inscription. This was a vastly more difficult challenge. Babylonian cuneiform, and by extension Assyrian, was not an alphabet. It was a mixed system where a single sign could represent an entire word, a syllable, or even just a sound depending on the context. A sign that looked like a star could mean God or heaven, but it could also be used to represent the syllable an. This meant that a single line of text was a dense, multi-layered code that had to be unpacked sign by sign. This was not a solitary effort but a vibrant, international race of minds. Rawlinson, Hincks, and others, including French and German scholars, worked sometimes collaboratively, sometimes competitively, publishing their findings and challenging each other's theories. They would test their growing understanding on known phrases like the standard opening of royal inscriptions, "I am king's name, king of land, son of father's name." When they could successfully read these formulaic passages on tablets from Nineveh, they knew they were on the right track. The real breakthrough came when they moved beyond these royal boasts and began to recognize the grammatical structures. The verb tenses, the noun cases, the pronouns that form the skeleton of any living language. They were no longer just reading names, they were beginning to understand syntax and meaning. The moment of ultimate validation arrived when a scholar would take a newly deciphered text and read it aloud, and the words formed coherent, logical sentences that matched the context of the relief or the expected content of a royal decree. The meaningless scratches were transforming before their very eyes into the living voice of the ancient Assyrians. With the code cracked, the true magnitude of the discovery at Nineveh could finally be appreciated. The mountain of broken clay in the British Museum was no longer an impenetrable mystery. It was a library, and it was now open for business. Scholars could begin the painstaking work of sorting the fragments, joining broken pieces, and most importantly, reading. They moved from the simple, repetitive language of royal annals to the complex, poetic verses of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the intricate diagnoses of medical texts, and the nuanced language of international treaties. The decipherment of cuneiform did more than just unlock a single library. It flung open the doors to an entire forgotten world. It gave us back the history, literature, and scientific thought of Mesopotamia, allowing the people of Nineveh and Babylon to speak to us directly across the vast gulf of time. The silent library had finally found its voice. Among the countless thousands of tablets that arrived at the British Museum, one scholar's patient work would soon trigger a shockwave that would reverberate far beyond the world of academia. That man was George Smith, a former banknote engraver whose brilliant, self-taught skill with cuneiform had earned him a position at the museum. Day after day, he sat in a back room, meticulously sorting through the mountain of broken clay, piecing together fragments like a literary detective. Then, in 1872, he was studying a particular group of tablets that told a story of a great king named Gilgamesh. As he slowly translated the text, a familiar narrative began to emerge, a story of a man warned by a god to build a boat, to gather his family and animals of every kind to survive a catastrophic flood sent to destroy humanity. Smith, a man of his time and place, immediately recognized the parallel to the biblical story of Noah's Ark. The realization was so staggering that, according to his own account, he jumped up and began to run around the room in a state of sheer, uncontrollable excitement, and to the astonishment of his colleagues, he reportedly started to tear his clothes off. He had found proof in a text over 1,000 years older than the Book of Genesis that the flood narrative was not a unique Israelite story, but a foundational myth shared across the ancient Near East. This single discovery propelled the epic of Gilgamesh from an obscure Assyrian text into an international sensation, rewriting our understanding of literary and religious history overnight. So what is this epic that caused such a stir? At its heart, it is the story of a man's confrontation with his own mortality. Gilgamesh is introduced as the king of Uruk, but he is no benevolent ruler. He is 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a tyrant of immense strength and energy who abuses his power, forcing his people into labor and claiming the right to sleep with brides on their wedding night. His desperate subjects pray to the gods for relief, and the gods respond by creating his mirror opposite, Enkidu, a wild man of the wilderness, covered in hair and living among the animals. Enkidu is civilized through an encounter with a temple priestess, and he travels to Uruk to challenge Gilgamesh's oppression. Their meeting erupts into a titanic battle, but instead of ending in death, it culminates in a profound and powerful friendship. This bond transforms both men. Gilgamesh finds a true equal, and Enkidu finds a purpose. Together, they embark on grand, heroic adventures to slay monstrous guardians and achieve immortal fame, believing that glorious deeds are the only way for a mortal to be remembered. But the epic takes a devastating turn when the gods decide that for their arrogance in killing the monster Humbaba and insulting the goddess Ishtar, one of the friends must die. Enkidu is struck with a debilitating illness, and Gilgamesh is forced to watch helpless as his beloved companion suffers and slowly slips away. The death of Enkidu shatters Gilgamesh's worldview. For the first time, he is confronted not with an external monster he can fight, but with the internal, unassailable reality of death. His grief is raw and overwhelming, and it ignites a new, desperate quest. Terrified that the same fate awaits him, Gilgamesh abandons his kingdom and sets out to find the secret of eternal life. His journey leads him to the ends of the earth, through a dark tunnel under a mountain where the sun travels at night, and finally to the only man granted immortality by the gods, Utanapishti, the Mesopotamian Noah. It is here, in this pivotal conversation, that the flood story George Smith discovered is recounted, as Utanapishti explains how he earned his eternal life. Gilgamesh, thinking he has found the answer, is then subjected to a test. Utanapishti challenges him to stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights, a simple task if he were truly worthy of joining the ranks of the immortal. But Gilgamesh, exhausted from his journey, fails immediately, falling into a deep sleep. It is a crushing symbolic defeat, proving his fundamental human frailty. As a final consolation, Utanapishti's wife persuades her husband to tell Gilgamesh of a secret plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore a man's youth. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves the plant, and begins his journey home, filled with a new hope. But in a moment of cruel irony, he stops to bathe in a freshwater pool, and while he is resting, a snake slithers up and steals the plant, immediately shedding its skin as it departs. This is the epic's final, heartbreaking lesson. Gilgamesh returns to the walls of his city, Uruk, empty-handed. He has not achieved immortality, but he has achieved wisdom. He sits down and, in a profound act of acceptance, dictates his story to a scribe, instructing that it be inscribed on the very walls of the city itself. His legacy will not be an endless life, but the enduring story of his life, preserved in clay and stone for future generations. The survival of this profound and complete narrative is owed entirely to the obsessive efforts of King Ashurbanipal. The Epic of Gilgamesh was not a new story. It was an ancient tale composed centuries before his reign, with fragments found all across Mesopotamia. But it was Ashurbanipal's scribes in Nineveh who compiled, edited, and preserved the most complete and standardized version known to us today. They gathered the disparate tablets from different cities and traditions and created a definitive 12-tablet edition for the royal library. Without this act of centralized preservation, the epic would likely have survived only in frustrating, incomplete fragments, its full power and narrative arc lost to us. The Library of Nineveh did not just happen to have a copy of Gilgamesh. It held the master copy, the version that allowed modern scholars to understand the epic as a cohesive and powerful whole. This single text became the ultimate vindication of Ashurbanipal's entire project, proving that his library was not merely a storage facility for administrative records, but a sanctuary for the deepest and most enduring creations of the human spirit, works that could speak across millennia about the universal struggles of life, friendship, loss, and our shared fragile mortality. But the library's value extends far beyond its literary masterpieces. If we shift our gaze from the epic poetry to another section of the collection, we find ourselves in what we might call the world's first medical school and observatory combined. The Assyrians approached illness and the human body with a fascinating blend of sharp-eyed observation, practical botany, and a deep-seated belief in the supernatural causes of disease. Their medical texts, meticulously copied and stored in the library, reveal a system that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. A typical medical tablet might begin with a list of symptoms, described with a clinical precision that feels surprisingly modern. For instance, one text details a patient suffering from recurring fever, chills, and a yellowing of the skin and eyes, a description that aligns perfectly with what we now know as malaria or hepatitis. The physician, or Ashurpu, would then follow this diagnosis with a detailed prescription. These were not simple guesses. They were complex recipes derived from a vast pharmacological knowledge of the natural world. The treatments themselves showcase this unique duality. A prescription for a wound might instruct the healer to create a poultice from a mixture of crushed herbs like myrtle and thyme, mixed with beer and resin. This combination likely had genuine antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties, offering real relief to the patient. But the same text would then mandate that the poultice be applied while the healer recited a specific incantation to a god of healing, such as Nineveh or Gula. To our modern minds, this seems like a contradiction, but to the Assyrian healer, it was a complete and holistic approach. The physical cure addressed the symptom, while the spiritual incantation addressed the perceived root cause, perhaps a demon that had invaded the body or the wrath of an offended deity. They saw no boundary between the physical and spiritual realms. Both had to be treated in tandem for a cure to be effective. This library was their central database for these integrated protocols, ensuring that a physician in any part of the empire could access the correct combination of herb and prayer for hundreds of different ailments. Beyond medicine, the library's scientific collections demonstrate a powerful drive to understand and codify the laws of the natural world. Their mathematical tablets are a testament to this, though their system was very different from our base 10 decimal system. The Assyrians, like their Babylonian predecessors, used a base 60 system, a legacy that still echoes in our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. Tablets filled with complex multiplication and division tables, calculations for the area of fields, and the volume of excavated earth for construction projects show that this was a civilization built on precision engineering and advanced administration. They could solve quadratic equations and work with what we now call Pythagorean triples, understanding the relationship between the sides of a right-angled triangle over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. This mathematical prowess was not abstract. It was essential for everything from calculating the rations needed for a massive army on the march to designing the precise gradients of the magnificent aqueducts that brought water to Nineveh. Perhaps the most extensive scientific collection in the library was dedicated to astronomy, though their motivation was again a blend of careful observation and divine interpretation. Assyrian scholars, often priests, meticulously recorded the movements of the planets, the phases of the moon, and the appearance of comets and meteors. They created detailed star charts and could predict lunar eclipses with impressive accuracy, but they were not doing this for pure science. In their worldview, the heavens were a giant, divine tablet upon which the gods wrote messages about the fate of the king and the empire. An eclipse was not merely a celestial event, it was a direct omen, a potential warning of a king's impending illness or a coming rebellion. The library housed enormous, multi-tablet series known as Omen collections, with entries that read like a celestial dictionary. One famous series, Enuma Anu Enlil, contained thousands of these correlations. For example, it might state, "If the moon is eclipsed on the first day of the month, the king will die and his son will not take the throne." Or, "If Venus appears in the east in the month of Ayaru, the harvest will be plentiful." The king's personal scribes and scholars would consult these tablets daily, comparing them to what was observed in the night sky to provide counsel on matters of state, from when to launch a military campaign to when to perform a specific religious ritual. This incredible fusion of disciplines reveals the true nature of the library at Nineveh. It was not a place where knowledge was neatly compartmentalized into separate shelves for science, religion, and literature. Instead, it was a single, unified system where every piece of information was interconnected. A mathematical calculation could determine the dimensions of a temple, the construction of which was guided by celestial omens, and the health of the priests within that temple was maintained by medical texts that blended herbal science with divine incantation. The Assyrians were building a complete model of their universe, and Ashurbanipal's library was the hard drive where all the data was stored. It shows us a society that was relentlessly pragmatic and fiercely intellectual, using every tool at its disposal from the scalpel to the star chart, to navigate a world they believed was governed by both observable laws and invisible divine forces. This collection proves that the empire's strength was not just in its armies, but in the minds of its scholars who sought to understand and master the complex world around them. While the Epic of Gilgamesh and the medical texts reveal the intellectual and spiritual pursuits of the Assyrians, another entire wing of the library was dedicated to the raw mechanics of power. Here, stored on thousands of tablets, were the royal decrees, international treaties, and diplomatic letters that formed the operational manual for running the largest empire the world had yet seen. These were not literary creations, they were the pragmatic, day-to-day instruments of command. Imagine a decree from the king himself, stamped with his royal seal, dictating the movement of 10,000 soldiers to a rebellious province, or authorizing the construction of a new aqueduct to bring water to a fledgling city. These texts give us a direct, unvarnished window into the colossal administrative effort required to manage territories stretching from Egypt to Iran. We can read the actual correspondence between Ashurbanipal and his provincial governors, filled with reports on harvest yields, updates on local unrest, and requests for resources. One letter might detail the need for more iron to forge weapons, while another complains about a corrupt official skimming from the grain stores. This was the empire's central nervous system, and the library was its brain, ensuring that the king's will, transmitted through these written orders, could be felt instantly in the most distant outpost. Beyond these internal directives, the library preserved the delicate web of international relations. Treaties with rival powers like Elam or client states in the Levant were carefully copied and stored. These were not merely symbolic gestures, they were complex legal documents, often sworn in the names of the gods of both nations, with meticulously detailed clauses and terrifying curses for anyone who would break the agreement. A treaty tablet might specify exact borders, outline terms of trade, and establish protocols for the extradition of fugitives. To read one is to understand that Assyrian diplomacy was a sophisticated blend of legal precision and psychological intimidation. The presence of these documents in the library underscores a crucial point. Knowledge of your allies and your enemies was just as critical as knowledge of your own resources. For Ashurbanipal, having immediate access to the exact terms of a treaty signed by his father 50 years earlier was a vital tool of statecraft, allowing him to hold other kingdoms to their word or to justify military action if they strayed. Yet, for all this practical bureaucracy, the Assyrian king did not make major decisions based on administrative reports alone. He relied on what he believed was a far higher source of intelligence, the will of the gods, revealed through a sophisticated science of divination. This is where the library's most extensive and, to modern eyes, most esoteric collections come into play: the vast archives of Omen texts. The Assyrians lived in a world they believed was constantly communicating with them. Every unusual event in nature was a potential message from the divine realm, a sign that could foretell victory, famine, the death of a king, or the stability of the dynasty. To ignore these signs was to invite catastrophe. Therefore, the king employed teams of highly trained scholar priests, and their entire body of knowledge, centuries of accumulated observations and interpretations, was stored in the library of Nineveh. This was not superstition in the simple sense. It was a complex, systematic field of study, a science of reading the universe, the most common form of divination, and one that the library documents in exhaustive detail. Was extispicy, the art of reading the future from the entrails, particularly the liver, of a sacrificed sheep. The procedure was a precise ritual. A perfect, healthy lamb would be selected and its throat cut. The liver, an organ the Assyrians saw as the seat of emotion and life, would be carefully extracted and examined. The priest was not looking at random bumps. He was comparing the organ's features against a vast catalogue of possibilities recorded on the library's tablets. The shape of the gallbladder, the presence of a notch on the lobus pyramidalis, the pattern of the portal vein, each variation had a specific meaning. The library contained detailed diagrams of clay liver models like teaching aids, showing what a positive liver for a military campaign looked like versus a negative one warning of disease. Before launching a major battle, the king would order a sacrifice, and his priests would consult these reference texts to deliver a verdict. The signs are favorable, or the gods are opposed. This practice placed a powerful tool in the hands of the king and his priests, allowing them to sanction or delay any state action with the unquestionable authority of divine will. The world of omens extended far beyond the sacrificial altar. The library's collections categorized and interpreted signs from every conceivable source. A significant portion was dedicated to celestial omens, where the movements of planets, the appearance of comets, and especially lunar and solar eclipses were seen as direct messages concerning the king's life and the health of the nation. A text might state that if Mars approaches the constellation Scorpio, the enemy will launch a secret attack. Another would warn that a solar eclipse in a certain month foretells the death of a great king. The birth of deformed animals, the pattern of oil dropped into a bowl of water, or even the way a flame crackled in a lamp, all of it was grist for the diviner's mill. The sheer volume of these texts is staggering, representing a monumental effort to find order and predictability in a seemingly chaotic world. For the king, this was a form of risk management. By consulting the omens, he was essentially gathering as much data as possible, both earthly and divine, before making a decision that could affect millions of lives. This intimate fusion of practical governance and divination reveals the core of Assyrian kingship. The royal decrees and the omen texts were not separate categories of knowledge, they were two sides of the same coin. A letter from a governor about a potential rebellion was a piece of terrestrial data. A liver reading conducted that same day about the same issue was a piece of celestial data. The king was expected to synthesize both before acting. This system gave the monarchy its immense ideological strength. A military victory was not just the result of superior tactics and iron weapons. It was proof that the gods had sanctioned the campaign through favorable omens. Conversely, a defeat could be explained as the result of an unheeded omen or a failure in ritual purity. For Ashurbanipal, collecting and controlling this entire body of knowledge, both the administrative and the divinatory, was the ultimate expression of his power. He wasn't just collecting texts out of intellectual curiosity. He was amassing the tools to rule both the visible and invisible worlds. By centralizing the omen collections in his library, he ensured that the definitive interpretation of the gods will resided with him and his court scholars, making his palace the sole conduit between heaven and earth, and solidifying his role as the empire's indispensable intermediary with the divine. Behind every single tablet in Ashurbanipal's library stood a figure whose name was almost never recorded in the royal annals, yet whose work was absolutely indispensable: the scribe. These were not mere copyists, they were the highly trained, multilingual intellectuals who formed the backbone of the entire Assyrian knowledge economy. To become a scribe was to embark on one of the most demanding career paths in the ancient world, a journey that began in childhood and required years of disciplined apprenticeship. A young boy, typically from a well-to-do family, would enter a scribble school, often attached to a temple or palace, where he would spend his days hunched over lumps of wet clay, mastering the bewilderingly complex cuneiform script. He had to learn not just one, but two primary languages: Akkadian, the lingua franca of the empire, and Sumerian, the ancient classical language of religion and law that was no longer spoken but was essential for any serious scholar, much like Latin in medieval Europe. The training was relentless, involving endless repetition. A student would practice writing lists of signs, then lists of words, then entire standard phrases, over and over again, until the intricate combinations of wedges and lines were etched into his muscle memory as deeply as they were into the clay. The work of a fully qualified scribe in the royal library was astonishingly varied and went far beyond the simple act of transcription. When a new text arrived from a captured city in Babylonia or was sent as a diplomatic gift from a neighboring kingdom, the scribe's first task was often that of an editor and a translator. He would carefully read the original, which might be written in a different dialect or contain archaic phrasing, and then produce a fresh, clean copy in standard Assyrian cuneiform. For particularly important literary or religious works, this process involved collation. A senior scribe might have several different versions of the same epic poem on his desk, each from a different city, and his job was to compare them line by line, resolving contradictions and producing a single, definitive version for the king's collection. This required deep scholarly judgment. They were also authors and composers in their own right, drafting royal letters, composing hymns for state ceremonies, and writing the detailed astronomical reports that were so vital for the diviners. Furthermore, they were the librarians, developing the sophisticated cataloging system that made the vast collection usable. They wrote the small clay labels that identified baskets of tablets, and they were the ones who knew exactly which shelf held the medical texts for lung diseases and which contained the specific omens for interpreting dreams. One of the most personal and poignant glimpses we get into the lives of these anonymous scholars comes from the scribal colophon. This was a note typically inscribed at the end of a tablet that functioned as a signature, a source citation, and sometimes a powerful protective charm. A simple colophon might just state, written according to its original, collated and checked, but many are far more revealing. Some proudly name the scribe responsible, giving us the rare privilege of knowing individuals like Nabu-Zukup Kenu, a master scribe who worked for Ashurbanipal and whose copies were renowned for their accuracy. Other colophons specify the source of the original text, noting it was copied from a tablet captured in Babylon or from an archetype found in the temple of a specific god. This meticulous sourcing shows a modern sense of scholarly responsibility and a desire to trace the lineage of knowledge. The most dramatic colophons, however, are those that contain curses. Understanding the immense value and effort embodied in each tablet, scribes would sometimes inscribe a warning to any future reader or handler. A typical curse might read something like, "He who breaks this tablet, or puts it in water, or tears it out of the hands of another, may the great gods glare at him angrily and swiftly obliterate his name and seed from the land." This was not an empty threat in a society that believed deeply in the power of divine retribution. It was a desperate plea for the preservation of their life's work, a magical lock placed on the knowledge they had so painstakingly preserved. These curses connect us directly to the human beings behind the script. We can feel their pride in a job well done, their scholarly rigor in citing sources, and their profound anxiety that all their careful work could be erased in an instant by carelessness or malice. They were the guardians of a fragile tradition, and they knew it. Without this anonymous army of scribes, Ashurbanipal's grand vision of a universal library would have been nothing more than a king's idle fantasy. The royal decree provided the authority and the resources, but it was the scribes who provided the skill, the intellect, and the countless hours of focused labor. They were the ones who deciphered the messy handwriting of a provincial scholar, who tracked down a missing line of poetry, who ensured that the medical prescription for a fever was copied without a single misplaced sign that could render it useless or dangerous. They transformed a chaotic influx of texts from across an empire into an organized, accessible, and living repository of wisdom. They were the true architects of the library, the unsung heroes who built, word by careful word, the intellectual fortress that would outlast their empire, their city, and even their language, silently ensuring that the voice of Mesopotamia could one day speak again. Now, let's step into the shoes of the librarians of Nineveh and consider the monumental physical challenge they faced every single day. We're accustomed to libraries of whisper-thin paper and feather-light digital files, but the great library of Ashurbanipal was a world of weight and substance. Its foundational unit was the clay tablet, and each one, from a small administrative note to a multi-column literary masterpiece, had a tangible, often substantial, physical presence. A single tablet could weigh anywhere from a few ounces to several pounds. Now, multiply that by the 30,000 tablets and fragments we've recovered, and you begin to grasp the sheer mass of this collection. The library didn't just contain knowledge, it was a structure built from tons of fired clay, a fortress of information whose very walls were these inscribed blocks. Managing this colossal physical archive required logistical genius. turning the act of simply storing and retrieving a text into a feat of engineering and organization that would challenge any modern archivist. The first challenge was organization. How do you find a specific medical prescription or a particular celestial omen in a sea of nearly identical-looking clay rectangles? The Assyrian librarians developed a system that was both ingenious and practical. Tablets weren't just piled on shelves at random. They were grouped systematically, often by subject matter. All the texts related to liver divination might be stored together in one set of baskets, while the entire series of the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its 12 numbered tablets, would be kept in sequence in another. For longer works that spanned multiple tablets, scribes would often include a catch line at the end of each tablet, the first line of the next tablet in the series, functioning like a continued on next page instruction to ensure the correct order was maintained. But the real key to their system was their version of the library catalog, the clay label. These were small, thumbnail-sized pieces of clay, often shaped like a baked bean, that were inscribed with a brief description of the contents of a particular container. A label might read, 14 tablets of medical prescriptions, or tablets of the series when the exorcist goes to the house of a sick person. These tags were then attached by a string to the relevant basket, jar, or wooden chest, allowing a librarian or scribe to quickly scan the labels to locate the precise group of tablets they needed without having to handle and read each individual one. The creation of each of these tablets was itself a careful, multi-stage craft. It all began with the clay, which was likely sourced from the banks of the nearby Tigris River. This raw clay wasn't used straight from the ground, it was purified. Scribes or their assistants would meticulously knead it, removing pebbles, bits of straw, and air bubbles to create a smooth, pliable, and consistent medium. They would then take a lump of this prepared clay and shape it into a pillow-shaped tablet, its surface slick with a thin layer of water to prevent the stylus from sticking. The writing instrument, or stylus, was typically a sharpened reed cut to create a triangular tip. The distinctive wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform were made by pressing the corner of this reed into the wet clay at different angles and depths. A scribe's skill was measured by the clarity, consistency, and elegance of these impressions, which had to be deep enough to be legible but not so deep as to pierce the tablet. Writing was a permanent act, there was no eraser. A significant mistake often meant scraping the entire surface smooth and starting over, or simply discarding the botched tablet and preparing a new one. Once the writing was complete, the tablet's journey was not over. For everyday administrative documents meant for short-term use, a tablet might simply be left to dry in the sun, becoming hard enough to be handled but still vulnerable to moisture. However, for the prized texts destined for the royal library, the literary, scientific, and religious works that were meant to last, a more permanent solution was required. Many of these tablets were fired in kilns, a process that transformed the fragile clay into durable, ceramic-like material. Interestingly, for the Library of Nineveh, this firing process was often not a deliberate act of preservation by the Assyrians themselves, but a catastrophic gift from their enemies. As we discussed, the intense fire that consumed the palace during the city's sack in 612 BC acted as a giant, if uneven, kiln, baking the library's collections and inadvertently ensuring their survival for millennia. This means that many of the tablets we study today were essentially fossilized in the moment of the city's destruction, their final firing a result of the very event that sought to erase them. This medium of clay, while incredibly durable over the long term, presented immediate and constant challenges for the librarians. Storage was a primary concern. Wooden shelves and racks were used, but the immense weight of the collection would have placed enormous strain on the palace architecture. Baskets and clay pots were likely the most common storage containers, offering a way to group related texts and distribute the load. Retrieval was another physical task. A scribe looking for a specific Omen text couldn't just quickly flip through a stack of pages. He had to locate the correct labeled basket, lift it down, and then carefully sift through the heavy, clinking tablets inside to find the right one. The risk of damage was ever present. A tablet dropped from even a short height could shatter into multiple fragments, a disaster for a unique text. This physicality fundamentally shaped how knowledge was accessed and used. Consulting the library was not a casual act, it was a deliberate, physical endeavor. It encouraged careful planning and minimized frivolous browsing. The very weight and permanence of the medium lent the words themselves a greater gravity, reminding every user that they were handling not just ideas, but physical objects that embodied the immense labor of scribes and the powerful will of a king who believed that controlling knowledge was the ultimate form of power. From the perspective of the 19th century, the removal of the tablets was not an act of theft but one of salvation. When Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam first laid eyes on the mounds of Nineveh, they were not looking at a protected archaeological site but a vast, neglected landscape used by locals as a quarry for building stone. The colossal sculptures they uncovered were routinely burned for lime or deliberately defaced. In their minds and in the prevailing attitude of the era, they were racing against time and indifference to rescue these priceless artifacts from certain oblivion. They operated with the permission of the Ottoman authorities who governed the region at the time, and they firmly believed they were bringing these treasures into the safe, scholarly hands of the British Museum, where they could be studied, preserved, and presented to an admiring world. For them, this was a noble endeavor, a grand project of enlightenment that was recovering lost chapters of human history for the benefit of all mankind. The crates shipped down the Tigris were not seen as loot, but as lifeboats for a civilization on the verge of being forgotten forever. This historical context, however, collides forcefully with the ethical sensibilities of our modern world. The concept of cultural patrimony, the idea that a nation's ancient heritage rightfully belongs to its people and its soil, has fundamentally reshaped the conversation. From this contemporary viewpoint, the actions of Layard and Rassam, however well-intentioned, look very different. The permissions granted by a colonial-era Ottoman administration are now seen by many as illegitimate, not representing the will of the Iraqi people. The removal of these foundational texts is viewed as a profound loss, a severing of a direct link between a modern nation and its ancient past. For Iraq, the tablets of Nineveh are not just interesting artifacts, they are the birth certificate of its civilization, a source of immense national pride, and a vital educational resource that was taken away. The argument is that their rightful home is in the land where they were created, where they can inspire local students and scholars and help build a continuous cultural identity that stretches back thousands of years. This clash of perspectives fuels the intense and ongoing global debate over repatriation. On one side of the argument are those who champion the idea of the Universal Museum. They contend that institutions like the British Museum act as stewards for all of humanity, preserving artifacts in a stable, secure environment and making them accessible to millions of international visitors and a global network of scholars. They argue that concentrating such material in world capitals fosters a broader understanding of our shared human story, transcending modern national borders. The counter-argument is powerful and emotionally resonant, that this very act of universal preservation often came at the cost of disinheriting the source culture. Keeping the Rosetta Stone in London or the Nefertiti bust in Berlin, critics say, perpetuates a colonial dynamic where the cultural wealth of the global South remains largely in the museums of the global North. They ask a piercing question: would the British public accept the Stonehenge monoliths being displayed in a museum in Cairo or Beijing for the benefit of all mankind? The case of the Nineveh tablets sits at the very heart of this dilemma. Their preservation in the British Museum is undeniable. They survived the 19th and 20th centuries in a controlled, academic environment, while Iraq has endured wars, sanctions, and the tragic looting of its own National Museum in 2003. The 2014 rampage by ISIS through Mosul, and at the site of Nineveh itself, where they systematically destroyed irreplaceable statues and monuments, seem to validate the fears of those who argue for centralized international safekeeping. Yet this argument can also be seen as paternalistic, suggesting that the source nation is incapable of caring for its own heritage. In recent years, the conversation has matured beyond a simple binary of keep or return. There is a growing emphasis on partnership, on digital sharing through high-resolution scans and online databases, and on long-term loans that can bring artifacts home for temporary exhibitions. These collaborative models acknowledge the complex history of these objects while seeking a more equitable future, one where the people of Iraq can more directly connect with the magnificent library that once lay beneath their soil. The question of who truly owns the past may never have a single, easy answer, but the ongoing dialogue itself is a testament to how much we have come to value the diverse and interconnected threads of our human story. Before the discovery of Ashurbanipal's library, the world of the Old Testament was, for many, a kind of splendid isolation, a collection of sacred stories and histories that stood apart from the rest of the ancient world, unique in their divinity and seemingly without parallel. The Bible was its own universe, a sacred text whose historical context was largely imagined or inferred, but the sands of Nineveh delivered a seismic shock to this understanding. When scholars finally pieced together the epics and royal annals from the clay tablets, they weren't just reading about Assyria, they were reading the cultural and literary backdrop against which large portions of the Hebrew Bible were composed. This was not about disproving the Bible, but about contextualizing it, pulling it out of a historical vacuum and placing it firmly within the vibrant, complex, and often brutal world of the ancient Near East. Suddenly, the voices of Israel's neighbors, conquerors, and trading partners were heard again, and they had a great deal to say about the world the Israelites inhabited. The most stunning and immediate parallel was, of course, the flood story. George Smith's electrifying discovery of the Gilgamesh epic's flood narrative in 1872 sent ripples far beyond the academic world, creating a public sensation and a theological firestorm. For the first time, scholars held in their hands a detailed account of a global deluge commanded by disgruntled gods, with a hero named Utanapishti who was instructed to build a boat, take aboard his family and animals, and survive the flood that wiped out humanity. The similarities to the Genesis story of Noah were too precise to be coincidental. The divine decision to destroy mankind, the instruction to build a large vessel, the preservation of life, the sending out of birds to find dry land, and the eventual offering of a sacrifice that pleased the deity. The implications were profound. It demonstrated that the flood story was not a unique Israelite revelation, but a powerful piece of ancient Near Eastern mythology that was shared across cultures for centuries. The biblical version, with its distinct monotheistic and moral focus, one God, a world punished for its wickedness, and a covenant established, could now be seen as a powerful adaptation and refinement of a much older, widely known tradition, reworked to convey a specific theological message about justice, obedience, and divine grace. Beyond this literary blockbuster, the library provided a wealth of other, quieter but equally significant, parallels that reshaped the understanding of biblical wisdom and law. The Book of Proverbs, for instance, long celebrated as a unique repository of Israelite wisdom, was found to have striking counterparts in much older Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts. The famous Instructions of Shuruppak and the Counsels of Wisdom from Assyrian tablets offered the same kind of pragmatic, fatherly advice on everything from choosing a good wife to avoiding debt and speaking carefully. The realization dawned that Israel's wisdom literature was part of an international conversation, a genre of practical philosophy that circulated throughout the educated circles of the ancient world. Similarly, the foundational legal principle of an eye for an eye, found in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy, was seen to have a direct precedent in the Code of Hammurabi, a Babylonian law code that predates the biblical laws by centuries. This didn't diminish the Bible's significance. Instead, it showed that the Israelites were engaged with the legal and ethical thinking of their time, adapting and transforming common legal concepts within the framework of their covenant relationship with a single, just God. Perhaps even more dramatic than the literary parallels was the cold, hard evidence the library provided for the historical reality of biblical figures. For centuries, kings like Sennacherib and Hezekiah existed primarily within the pages of Scripture. Then, from the tablets of Nineveh, emerged Sennacherib's own royal annals, boasting of his military campaigns. One famous prism, known as the Taylor Prism, details his campaign against the kingdom of Judah and its king, Hezekiah. The prism boasts, "As for Hezekiah the Judahite, I besieged 46 of his strong walled towns. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage." This Assyrian account brilliantly corroborates the biblical narrative in the second book of Kings, which describes the same siege of Jerusalem. While the biblical version credits divine intervention for saving the city, and the Assyrian version spins the event as a strategic success for Sennacherib, both agree on the essential facts. A powerful Assyrian army invaded Judah, besieged its cities, and trapped King Hezekiah in Jerusalem. This was a monumental validation. For the first time, a specific event and person from the biblical narrative were confirmed by a contemporaneous, external source from a rival nation. It moved figures like Hezekiah from the realm of religious legend into the clear light of documented history. This flood of new information from Nineveh forced a fundamental and lasting reevaluation of the Hebrew Bible. It could no longer be read as a text that appeared out of nowhere. Scholars now had to approach it as a product of its time and place, a collection of documents that interacted with, responded to, and often polemicized against the dominant cultures of Mesopotamia and Canaan. The creation story in Genesis, for example, could be read alongside the Babylonian Enuma Elish, not as a derivative copy, but as a conscious theological argument. Where the Babylonian epic describes creation arising from a violent struggle between chaotic gods, Genesis presents a serene, orderly process commanded by a single, sovereign God who creates humanity in his own image. The Bible was, in many places, in dialogue with its neighbors, asserting a distinct identity and a revolutionary monotheistic faith against a backdrop of polytheism and imperial power. The discovery of the library did not diminish the Bible's power, it enriched our understanding of its purpose. It showed the biblical authors not as isolated scribes receiving dictation, but as engaged thinkers and theologians, using the stories, laws, and literary forms of their day to craft a powerful and enduring vision of God's relationship with humanity, a vision that was shaped in the crucible of history and spoken in the shared language of the ancient world. The thrill of discovery in the dusty trenches of Nineveh was only the prelude to a challenge of almost unimaginable scale waiting back in the museum vaults. When those crates from Mesopotamia were first opened in the British Museum, the initial wave of excitement was quickly tempered by a sobering reality. The great library of Ashurbanipal had not been found as a collection of pristine volumes on orderly shelves. Instead, it arrived as a mountain of shattered clay, a chaotic avalanche of countless fragments, many no larger than a fingernail. The destructive fire that had baked and preserved the tablets had also made them brittle, and the collapse of the palace roof had done the rest, crushing the shelves and scattering the contents. The result was not a library in any recognizable sense, but the world's most difficult and important three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, a puzzle with no picture on the box, where the pieces were made of fragile, fired clay and the guiding image was a language that had only just been deciphered. The first and most fundamental task for the curators was, and still is, the painstaking work of joining these fragments together. This is a discipline that requires the patience of a saint and the eye of a detective. Scholars don't just randomly try pieces against one another, they work from a set of sophisticated clues. The most obvious is the text itself. An expert in cuneiform can look at a fragment and recognize the specific handwriting of a particular scribe, the unique vocabulary of a medical text, or the poetic rhythm of a line from Gilgamesh. They then search for other fragments that continue that same story or subject matter. But the breaks themselves are also a guide. The physical contours of a broken edge are as unique as a fingerprint. A curator will spend hours, sometimes days, carefully examining the jagged line of one piece, mentally rotating it, and then scanning through trays of other fragments, searching for that one perfect match where the clay fits together seamlessly, the grooves locking into place to restore a single wedge-shaped sign or a complete word. It's a moment of quiet triumph that can suddenly make a broken list of omens transform into a coherent sentence, or turn a collection of scattered phrases back into a powerful, flowing narrative. Beyond the text and the breaks, scholars have become forensic scientists of ancient clay. They analyze the very fabric of the tablets, the clay composition itself. The mud used in different cities or even different workshops within Nineveh could have subtle variations in its mineral content, the size of the grit or temper mixed in, or its specific color after firing. By studying these properties, experts can sometimes determine that two seemingly unrelated fragments not only fit physically, but were also made from the exact same batch of clay, strongly suggesting they were part of the same original tablet. This is a slow, meticulous process that has been the primary method for over a century, a hands-on archaeology of the museum drawer that has gradually rebuilt thousands of texts from the ruins of the library, one tiny, painstaking join at a time. Today, this monumental effort is being supercharged by 21st century technology. The most powerful new tool in the curator's arsenal is three-dimensional scanning. High-resolution scanners can now create perfect digital replicas of every single fragment, capturing their shape and surface texture down to a microscopic level. Once these virtual models exist in a database, the real magic begins. Powerful computer algorithms can now be set loose on this digital mountain. These programs are designed to do what the human eye and brain do, but on a massive industrial scale. They can compare the three-dimensional contours of millions of broken edges against each other in a fraction of the time it would take a team of humans, proposing potential matches for scholars to then verify. This isn't about replacing the human expert. It's about augmenting their incredible skill, using raw computing power to filter out the impossible and highlight the probable, allowing the scholars to focus their profound linguistic and historical knowledge on the most promising connections. The impact of this digital revolution is profound and ongoing. Projects like the Ashurbanipal Library project at the British Museum are systematically scanning their entire collection, creating a virtual library that can be studied and reassembled without ever risking damage to the fragile originals through excessive handling. This means a scholar in Tokyo can work on joining fragments with a colleague in Chicago, both manipulating the same high-resolution, three-dimensional models on their screens. Furthermore, these digital joins are allowing for the reconstruction of tablets that were broken in ways we never could have fixed physically. Sometimes, the crucial connecting piece between two large fragments is simply missing, lost in antiquity or during the original excavation. But with a three-dimensional model, a computer can often extrapolate the shape of that missing bridge, allowing us to understand the text's continuity, even with a gap in the middle. It's a form of digital restoration that is breathing new life into texts we thought would forever remain broken. This means that the excavation of Ashurbanipal's library is far from over. While the physical digging at Nineveh has slowed, the most exciting discoveries are now happening in the quiet, climate-controlled basements of museums around the world. Every year, new joins are made. A fragment that has sat in a drawer for 150 years, labeled only as administrative text, might suddenly be recognized as the missing conclusion to a royal letter or a lost stanza of a hymn when it is digitally matched to another piece recently scanned. A single, successful join can change the entire interpretation of a text, revealing the name of a previously unknown official, clarifying the terms of a treaty, or completing a mythological story we only knew from a brief reference. This silent, ongoing scholarship is a powerful reminder that the library is not a static collection of dead artifacts, but a living, breathing body of knowledge that is still, piece by tiny piece, revealing its secrets to those patient enough to listen. The work of these dedicated curators and technologists ensures that the story of the world's first library continues to be written, not with shovels in the sand, but with scanners and algorithms in the pursuit of a puzzle whose final picture is the recovery of our own forgotten past. For all its breathtaking scope, the Library of Ashurbanipal represents only a fraction of what was once a living, breathing collection. We have been gifted an immense treasure, yes, but it is a treasure that comes with its own profound shadows, the ghostly outlines of what is missing. The library's own catalogues, those meticulous clay labels and lists created by the Assyrian librarians themselves, sometimes mention works that have, so far, never been found within the recovered fragments. It is a deeply frustrating experience for a scholar, akin to having the index of a magnificent book where several of the most promising chapters have been torn out. These catalogues reference specific series of Omen texts, hymns to lesser-known deities, and even what appear to be titles of epic poems that are completely unfamiliar to us. Their absence suggests that entire sections of the collection were housed in rooms that suffered a far more catastrophic fate during the sack of the city, perhaps crushed to dust or consumed in a fire so intense that the clay tablets themselves melted into an unrecognizable slag. Alternatively, these missing works might still be there, waiting in the vast, unexcavated portions of the palace complex, lying just beyond the reach of the 19th century trenches, protected by layers of earth and the passage of time. The potential loss extends beyond just individual titles to potentially entire genres of literature. We know from other Mesopotamian sites that storytelling took many forms. What about the rich tradition of love poetry or humorous fables, the ancient equivalents of short stories that would have offered a more intimate, personal glimpse into Assyrian daily life and humor? The library we have is overwhelmingly official, a collection curated by and for the state and the royal court. It is strong on theology, science, and epic grandeur, but where are the popular tales, the songs sung in the streets, the plays performed during festivals? The private correspondence of merchants, the diaries of farmers, the legal disputes of ordinary citizens, these voices from the common people, are largely silent in the halls of the North Palace. Their stories, written on tablets that were never deemed important enough for the king's library, or that were stored in the city's administrative buildings which were completely leveled, may be lost forever. Their absence creates a lopsided historical record, one that speaks powerfully of kings and gods, but whispers only faintly of the millions of subjects who built the empire with their hands. Consider also the specialized knowledge that may have vanished. The library contains medical texts, but what about the accompanying visual aids? Did Assyrian doctors use anatomical diagrams, sketches of surgical procedures, or illustrated herbals to identify medicinal plants? If such documents existed, they might have been drawn on perishable materials like wax-covered wooden boards or even papyrus, which would have disintegrated in the damp soil long ago. Similarly, the architects who designed Nineveh's monumental walls and magnificent palaces must have worked from detailed plans and engineering schematics. These blueprints for an empire, likely drawn on large clay tablets or parchment, have not survived in the library collection. Their loss means we can only reverse engineer their incredible architectural achievements from the ruins themselves, without understanding the precise calculations and creative vision that went into their design. The absence of these practical, visual records leaves a significant gap in our comprehension of how they translated abstract ideas into staggering physical reality. The international scope of Ashurbanipal's collecting mission also hints at other profound losses. His agents scoured the known world from Egypt to Anatolia. The library holds some Egyptian-style artifacts, but where are the Egyptian texts? It is almost certain that papyrus scrolls from the Nile Valley, filled with their own unique medical knowledge, magical spells, and administrative records, were brought to Nineveh as tribute or plunder. Papyrus, however, is fragile. In the humid climate of the Assyrian capital, unlike the dry Egyptian desert, these scrolls would have decayed relatively quickly, and the fire that preserved the clay tablets would have incinerated them completely. The same fate likely befell any writings on leather parchment or wax tablets from other cultures. This means that the library was almost certainly far more linguistically and culturally diverse than the collection of clay tablets alone suggests. We are left with the durable clay core of the collection, while the more perishable and potentially just as revealing documents from other great civilizations have evaporated from the historical record, leaving us to wonder what unique Egyptian or Hittite perspectives might have been sitting on those same shelves. This contemplation of what is missing is not an exercise in despair, but a crucial part of understanding history itself. It is a humbling reminder of the sheer fragility of our connection to the past. For every epic of Gilgamesh that survives, there may be a dozen other works of equal brilliance that are now just fine dust mixed into the soil of Iraq. These gaps fuel the imagination and drive the passion of archaeologists and historians. They are the unanswered questions that make the discovery of a single new tablet fragment such a thrilling event, because it always carries the potential to fill a void, to suddenly give voice to a silence that has lasted for millennia. The lost library of Ashurbanipal is therefore two libraries, the magnificent one we have painstakingly reconstructed, and the phantom one that lives in the negative space around it, a collection of shadows and whispers that reminds us that history is not just about what was saved, but also about what was lost, and that the pursuit of knowledge is an endless conversation with both the seen, the unseen. When we walk into a modern public library or university archive today, with its quiet halls of organized books and its digital catalogs accessible from anywhere in the world, it feels like a thoroughly contemporary idea. But the foundational principles that make such a place function were being tested and perfected in the dusty, clay-filled rooms of Ashurbanipal's palace over 2,600 years ago. The Great Library of Nineveh represents one of humanity's first and most ambitious attempts to systematically gather the entirety of known knowledge into a single, centralized location, not just for safekeeping but for active use and study. This was not a haphazard collection of trophies. It was a functioning institution built on a set of revolutionary organizational principles that would become the bedrock of every great library that followed. Ashurbanipal's vision was to create a universal repository, a place where a scholar or a royal administrator could find the answer to any question, from the proper ritual to appease an angry god to the most effective treatment for a fever. This core idea, that consolidating and organizing information is a source of immense power and progress, is the direct intellectual ancestor of every library from Alexandria to the Library of Congress, and it all started with one king's obsession with clay tablets. Consider the principle of cataloging, the very soul of any library. In Nineveh, they didn't have digital search bars or card catalogs, but they had an ingeniously simple and effective system, the clay label. These small, inscribed tags attached to baskets and jars identified the contents within, acting as the ancient world's equivalent of a call number. A librarian or scribe could quickly scan these labels to locate omens concerning lunar eclipses or medical prescriptions for eye diseases without having to handle and read through dozens of heavy, fragile tablets. This system of external metadata, of creating a separate, simplified finding aid for a larger collection, is a fundamental concept that has never become obsolete. It was refined in the Great Library of Alexandria, which famously attempted to catalog all of the scrolls in the known world, and it evolved through the centuries into the elaborate classification systems we use today, like the Dewey Decimal System. The Assyrian librarians understood that a collection without a map is just a pile of stuff. To be useful, knowledge must be navigable, and their clay labels were the first compasses designed for that very purpose. Beyond simple cataloging, the library at Nineveh pioneered the idea of subject specialization. The tablets weren't just stored at random, they were deliberately grouped by theme and genre. All the medical texts were kept together. The astronomical Omen series were stored in their own section, and the tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh were carefully numbered and placed in sequence. This physical organization by subject matter reflects a sophisticated understanding of knowledge itself. It acknowledges that information exists within a context, that a text about liver divination is more useful when placed next to other divinatory texts, and that a scholar studying medicine would want to browse related works. This principle of bringing like materials together to facilitate comparative study and deep research is a cornerstone of modern librarianship. Whether it's the dedicated science wing of a university library or the mystery section in a local bookstore, we are following the organizational logic first laid out by the curators of Ashurbanipal's collection. They recognized that the structure of a library should mirror the architecture of human understanding, with connected ideas housed under the same roof. Preservation was another critical mission that finds a direct echo in our modern institutions. For the Assyrians, the primary threat to their collection was physical decay or catastrophic destruction. Their solution was the medium of clay itself, and for the most important texts, the process of firing them into a near indestructible ceramic state. While their preservation methods were born of necessity and, ironically, completed by the fire of their enemies, the intent was clear: to safeguard knowledge for the future. Today, our libraries face different but equally urgent preservation challenges, from the acid-based paper of 19th century books slowly crumbling to dust, to the digital obsolescence that threatens our born digital records. Modern conservation labs use climate-controlled vaults, chemical treatments, and mass digitization projects to fight these battles. The underlying ethos, however, is identical to that of the Assyrian scribes who carefully copied crumbling older tablets onto fresh new ones, a profound sense of duty to act as stewards, to ensure that the knowledge of the present remains accessible to the generations of the future. The fight against time is a continuous thread connecting the kilns of Nineveh to the digital scanners of the 21st century. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Ashurbanipal's library is the very ambition it represents, the dream of a universal library. His was not a modest collection of royal annals. It was an attempt to gather every significant text from across the entire empire and beyond. He wanted his library to be comprehensive, to contain the sum total of Mesopotamian science, literature, religion, and law. This grand, almost impossibly ambitious goal would inspire every great library that came after. The most famous successor, the Library of Alexandria, shared this exact same vision, aiming to collect all the books in the world, translating works from every culture into Greek. While Alexandria focused on the papyrus scrolls of the Mediterranean world, its foundational philosophy was a direct inheritance from the clay tablet libraries of Mesopotamia. This ideal of universality has driven the creation of other monumental repositories throughout history, from the imperial libraries of ancient China to the great medieval monastic libraries that preserved classical learning. In our own time, this ancient dream has found its ultimate expression in the digital realm, with projects like the Internet Archive and Google Books attempting to create a truly global, universally accessible library of all human knowledge. The scale is now planetary, but the seed of the idea was planted in the soil of Nineveh. This perspective allows us to see Ashurbanipal in a new light. He was certainly a ruthless Assyrian emperor, a commander of armies and a subjugator of nations, but he was also a visionary who possessed a uniquely modern understanding of a powerful truth, that organized information is a primary source of authority and stability. He knew that to rule his vast empire effectively, he needed more than soldiers. He needed administrators who could reference old treaties, doctors who could consult standard medical texts, and priests who could correctly interpret the will of the gods using the definitive Omen series. By centralizing this knowledge, he centralized power. His library was the hard drive of the Assyrian state, and his scribes were the programmers who kept it running. This fusion of knowledge and power is a theme that has repeated itself ever since. From the scholarly courts of the Renaissance to the data-driven corporations of today, the ability to collect, organize, and retrieve information efficiently has always been a marker of a sophisticated and powerful society. Ashurbanipal was perhaps the first ruler to build his entire administration around this principle, and in doing so, he set a precedent that would shape the course of human civilization. His ambition echoes not just in the quiet halls of our libraries, but in the very structure of our modern, information-saturated world. The incredible journey of these clay tablets did not end when they were placed in museum display cases. In many ways, a new and equally critical chapter began the moment they entered the controlled environments of institutions like the British Museum. The fire that destroyed Nineveh paradoxically granted them a 2,500-year reprieve from the elements, but now, exposed to the modern world, they face a new and insidious array of threats. One of the most dangerous is an invisible enemy known as soluble salts. These mineral compounds are naturally present in the clay, and when the tablets are exposed to even slight fluctuations in humidity, these salts can dissolve and recrystallize just below the surface. Over repeated cycles, this process creates immense internal pressure, causing the clay to literally erupt, flaking off in layers and taking the precious cuneiform text with it forever. It's a slow, silent decay that can turn a perfectly intact tablet into a pile of dust over the course of decades if left unchecked. Beyond this chemical warfare, the tablets remain incredibly fragile physically. A simple slip of the hand, an accidental bump against a shelf, or the cumulative stress of being handled for study can cause a tablet to fracture, especially along old, weak fault lines from its initial breakage in antiquity. Even the seemingly benign factor of light, particularly the ultraviolet rays in sunlight or certain types of gallery lighting, can cause irreversible fading and damage to the clay's surface over time. The battle for the library's survival has shifted from the battlefield to the conservation lab, a race against the relentless, invisible forces of chemistry and physics. To combat these threats, conservators have become the library's new guardians, employing a blend of ancient patience and cutting-edge science. The first and most fundamental line of defense is environmental control. The rooms where the tablets are stored are kept at a constant, cool temperature and a stable, low humidity level, creating a climatic bubble that effectively puts the soluble salts to sleep, preventing their destructive cycle of dissolution and crystallization. When a tablet requires direct intervention, the process is a masterclass in meticulous care. Conservators might use a range of tools, from soft bristled brushes and specialized museum vacuums to remove loose dust, to fine scalpels and needles under a microscope for more delicate work. They never use water or chemicals for cleaning, as these could activate salts or dissolve the clay itself. The goal is always stabilization, not restoration. Their work is guided by a fundamental principle: do nothing that cannot be safely reversed by a future conservator with better technology. This means using adhesives that can be dissolved later and avoiding any permanent fills or reconstructions that might misinterpret the original object. It's a discipline of profound humility, treating each tablet not as a broken thing to be fixed, but as a unique historical document whose every crack and crumble is part of its authentic story. Alongside these physical preservation techniques, a revolutionary new form of safeguarding has emerged: digital conservation. This process begins with high-resolution photography, where each fragment is captured under different lighting conditions. One technique, called reflectance transformation imaging, involves taking dozens of photographs with a light source positioned at different angles. A computer then combines these images to create a single, interactive digital file where a scholar can virtually move the light across the tablet's surface. This can reveal faint impressions of the stylus that are completely invisible to the naked eye, bringing forth texts that were thought to be lost to erosion. The next step is three-dimensional modeling. Using laser scanners or photogrammetry, conservators create precise three-dimensional digital twins of the tablets. These models capture every minute detail: the depth of a wedge, the curve of a break, the texture of the clay. This is far more than just creating a pretty picture. It is a form of immortalization. If the worst should happen and a physical tablet is damaged or destroyed, its exact likeness survives in the digital realm, preserving its geometry and text for all time. This also allows for virtual handling, enabling researchers across the globe to manipulate, measure, and study the tablets without ever subjecting the fragile originals to the risks of shipping and physical examination. The impact of this digital revolution extends beyond mere preservation. It is fundamentally transforming access and research. projects like the British Museum's Ashurbanipal Library project are creating vast online databases where these high-resolution images and three-dimensional models are available for free to anyone with an internet connection. A student in Brazil, a historian in Japan, and an amateur enthusiast in Norway can all examine the same tablet simultaneously, zooming in to study a single enigmatic sign or rotating it to understand its physical form. This democratization of access shatters the physical and geographical barriers that have surrounded these artifacts for centuries. Furthermore, this digital library enables new forms of analysis that were previously impossible. Algorithms can be trained to recognize the handwriting of specific scribes, potentially identifying the work of a single individual across hundreds of different tablets. They can scour the entire collection for a rare word or a specific phrase in seconds, a task that would take a human scholar a lifetime. The digital realm is not just a backup, it is a new frontier for discovery, a collaborative, global workshop where the secrets of the library can be unlocked in ways Ashurbanipal himself could never have imagined. The fight to save these tablets is a continuous, active duty to the past, a commitment to ensuring that the voices from Nineveh, having survived fire and sword, will now also endure the slow passage of the ages, speaking their wisdom to every future generation. This digital transformation has fundamentally redefined who gets to walk the halls of Ashurbanipal's library. For over a century after its discovery, access to these tablets was a privilege reserved for a small, elite group of scholars who had the funding and credentials to travel to London and secure permission from the British Museum. The tablets themselves were locked away in vaults, their secrets guarded by geography and institutional barriers. But today, thanks to ambitious international digitization projects, that dynamic has been utterly overturned. Initiatives like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative based at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the British Museum's own Ashurbanipal Library project are systematically creating a virtual, borderless museum. They are using state-of-the-art equipment to capture ultra-high-resolution photographs and three-dimensional scans of every single fragment in their collections, from the most famous literary works to the smallest, unread administrative note. These images are then uploaded to public-facing websites, creating a free, open-access archive that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for anyone with an internet connection. A college student in Mumbai, a high school teacher in Norway, or a retired engineer in Chile can now, with a few clicks, pull up a crisp, zoomable image of a 4,000-year-old tablet, examining the very same cuneiform signs that were once studied only by the king's most trusted scribes. This is a democratization of knowledge on an unprecedented scale, tearing down the velvet ropes that have long surrounded this foundational piece of our shared human heritage. This new era of access is not just about passive viewing, it actively empowers a new generation of researchers and enthusiasts to participate directly in the process of discovery. In the past, an independent scholar or a passionate amateur might have a brilliant theory about a particular text, but proving it required writing letters to curators, hoping for grainy photocopies, or even traveling across the world. Now they can conduct their research from their own living room. They can download images, compare different versions of the same text held in museums on different continents, and use digital drawing tablets to trace signs and better understand a scribe's technique. Online forums and social media groups have become vibrant, global workshops where people from all walks of life gather to discuss tricky translations, share their findings, and collaborate on puzzles. We are witnessing the rise of what some call citizen Assyriology, where collective intelligence is being harnessed to advance the field. There are even crowd-sourced projects where volunteers help with tasks like matching broken fragments from digital images, tasks that computers still struggle with but the human brain excels at. This collaborative, open-source model is accelerating the pace of research in ways that would have been unimaginable just 2 decades ago, proving that the next great breakthrough in understanding ancient Mesopotamia might not come from a university professor, but from a curious software developer or a dedicated history buff working in their spare time. Beyond simply making existing texts more accessible, these digital tools are also forging entirely new paths of inquiry, allowing us to ask questions of the library that were previously impossible. One of the most exciting frontiers is the use of data mining and computational analysis. Imagine being able to search the entire corpus of 30,000 tablets in seconds for every occurrence of a specific word, like dream or copper. A scholar can now do this, tracing the evolution of a concept across centuries and genres, revealing how the meaning of a word changed from a religious omen to a mundane trade commodity. Linguists are using these vast digital datasets to perform sophisticated pattern recognition, analyzing the grammar and syntax on a massive scale to better understand the nuances of the Akkadian language, almost like teaching a computer to think like an Assyrian scribe. Another powerful technique is network analysis. By digitally mapping the references between different texts and the people and places mentioned within them, researchers can visualize the intellectual and social networks of the ancient world. They can see, for example, how a specific medical text from Babylon was cited and adapted by scribes in Nineveh, and then trace its influence on later works. This allows us to see the library not as a static collection of isolated works, but as a dynamic, interconnected web of knowledge, a living system that reflected the intellectual currents flowing across the empire. We are no longer just reading the tablets, we are listening to the conversations between them. This digital frontier is also revolutionizing the very physical reconstruction of the library. As we discussed, the collection was found in a devastatingly fragmentary state. The process of joining these pieces is being supercharged by digital matching algorithms. High-resolution, three-dimensional scans capture the unique topography of every broken edge with microscopic precision. Powerful computers can then compare these countless digital edges against one another, searching for the one in a million match that a human eye might miss after a lifetime of searching. This isn't just about putting physical pieces back together. It allows for virtual reconstruction. Sometimes the crucial piece connecting two large fragments is simply lost. But with precise three-dimensional models, a computer can extrapolate the shape of that missing bridge, allowing scholars to understand the flow of the text even with a physical gap. This means that texts we thought were forever incomplete are now being virtually restored, their narratives and information recovered. The digital realm is acting as a kind of universal glue, mending the library not in a physical sense, but in an intellectual one, piecing together the broken thoughts of ancient scholars and restoring the coherence of their work. The ultimate significance of the digital Nineveh is that it completes a profound circle, returning the library to its original, ambitious purpose but on a global scale. Ashurbanipal sought to gather all the world's knowledge into one physical location for the use of his court and his administration. Today, through the miracle of digital technology, we are taking that single, centralized collection and scattering its contents to every corner of the globe, making it available for the use of all humanity. The library is being reborn not in a palace of stone, but in the boundless, ethereal space of the cloud. It has been transformed from a symbol of imperial power into a monument to universal access and collaborative learning. The scholars of Nineveh collected knowledge to control and administer an empire. we are using that same knowledge to connect and enlighten a world. The digital realm has become the new fertile ground where the seeds of ancient wisdom are being replanted, promising a harvest of discovery that will continue to enrich our understanding of the human story for generations to come. The popular image of the Assyrians, seared into our collective memory from their own stone reliefs and the pages of the Bible, is one of unrelenting brutality. We see the colossal, impassive faces of the Lamashu guardians, the graphic depictions of prisoners being flayed alive, and the boastful royal annals that detail cities razed and populations deported. It is a portrait of a civilization that seems to worship power and savagery, a war machine of terrifying efficiency. This view, however, is a dramatic oversimplification, a one-dimensional caricature that shatters upon contact with the contents of Ashurbanipal's library. The very same culture that produced such vivid scenes of conquest also produced the profoundly moving epic of Gilgamesh, with its poignant meditation on friendship, loss, and the human struggle with mortality. How do we reconcile the king who ordered the mutilation of his enemies with the king who personally sought out and preserved this delicate, philosophical poetry? The library forces us to hold these two contradictory truths in our hands at once, compelling us to see the Assyrians not as monsters, but as a complex, multifaceted society whose intellectual and spiritual life was as rich and developed as its military prowess was formidable. This cognitive dissonance is perhaps most striking when we move from the grand narrative of empire to the intimate, practical details of daily life preserved in the library's scientific and medical texts. The same state apparatus that could orchestrate the siege of a city with cold, mathematical precision also funded and organized a sophisticated medical corps. Their diagnostic handbooks reveal a mindset that was not merely superstitious, but deeply observant and systematic. A physician treating a wound didn't just rely on incantations. He followed a precise, multi-step protocol for cleaning, applying poultices made from known antiseptic herbs like myrrh and thyme, and bandaging. They diagnosed symptoms we recognize today, from the ringing in the ears characteristic of tinnitus to the visual disturbances of migraines. This demonstrates a culture engaged in a constant, rational struggle to understand and master the physical world, to alleviate suffering and prolong life. The library was their central research hospital, a place where empirical knowledge was accumulated, tested, and preserved. This is not the behavior of a society obsessed only with death and domination. It is the hallmark of a civilization that valued order, health, and the practical application of knowledge for the stability and well-being of its people, from the highest general to the lowest foot soldier. The library further complicates the picture by revealing an empire deeply engaged with abstract thought and the fundamental questions of existence. Beyond the practical sciences, the collection is filled with texts on divination and omens, which we might easily dismiss as mere superstition. But to do so is to miss the point. The vast collections of celestial omens, for instance, represent a monumental, centuries-long project to find pattern, meaning, and predictability in a seemingly chaotic universe. The Assyrian priests who tracked the movements of planets with such meticulous care were, in their own way, the theoretical physicists of their age. They believed the cosmos operated on a set of divine laws, and their life's work was to decipher that code. This reflects a powerful intellectual drive to understand humanity's place in the cosmos, to discern a grand narrative behind the random events of life and nature. The desire to read the will of the gods in a sheep's liver is at its core the same human impulse that drives modern scientific inquiry, a profound need to explain the unknown and exert some measure of control over an unpredictable world. The library shows us that the Assyrian mind was capable of both the brutal calculus of geopolitics and the lofty, philosophical yearning to comprehend the ultimate order of things. When we consider the library as a whole, we begin to see that these two sides of the Assyrian character, the brutal and the intellectual, were not separate, but were inextricably linked. The same organizational genius that allowed them to coordinate supply lines for an army of tens of thousands was applied to the monumental task of cataloging tens of thousands of clay tablets. The same impulse to control and administer a vast, diverse empire fueled the desire to centralize all of its knowledge. For Ashurbanipal, knowledge was not a passive hobby, it was a vital tool of statecraft. Understanding the medical traditions of conquered Babylon meant he could better care for his own army and administrators stationed there. Possessing the definitive Omen texts gave his priests, and by extension his throne, the ultimate authority to interpret the divine will, legitimizing his wars and his policies. Controlling the literary and scientific heritage of Mesopotamia was a form of cultural imperialism, a way of asserting Assyria as the rightful heir and ultimate synthesizer of all ancient wisdom. In this light, the library appears not as a contradiction to Assyrian militarism, but as its logical extension, the intellectual wing of the imperial project. Ultimately, the great gift of Ashurbanipal's library is the gift of nuance. It refuses to let us settle for the easy, one-dimensional story of the bloodthirsty Assyrian. It forces a more difficult but far more human understanding. A civilization can be capable of breathtaking artistic beauty and systematic cruelty. It can produce literature that explores the vulnerability of friendship while its armies practice calculated terror. It can seek to heal the human body with one hand and break the human spirit with the other. This complexity is not an ancient anomaly. It is a mirror held up to the entirety of human history. The Library of Nineveh stands as a powerful testament to the fact that no culture, no matter how formidable or feared, can be reduced to a single adjective. Knowledge in all its forms has a way of complicating our simple narratives, revealing the profound depths and troubling contradictions that lie at the heart of every human endeavor, reminding us that the capacity for great creativity and great destruction have always existed side by side in the human story. The story of Nineveh, however, does not end with its ancient destruction or its dramatic Victorian rediscovery. It continues into our own turbulent century, where the ancient mounds faced a new and devastating wave of violence, this time not from rival empires, but from the chaos of modern warfare and the calculated iconoclasm of ideological extremism. The modern city of Mosul in Iraq grew to envelop the ancient ruins, its bustling neighborhood spreading right up to the feet of the tells of Khanjik and Nebi Yunus. For decades, these mounds stood as quiet, if neglected, guardians of the past, with the local community living in their long shadow. This fragile coexistence was shattered in 2003 with the American-led invasion of Iraq and the subsequent collapse of state authority. The National Museum in Baghdad was infamously looted, a tragedy that sent shockwaves around the world, but the damage was not confined to the capital. Across the country, archaeological sites became unprotected treasure troves for desperate locals and organized criminal networks. The ancient city of Nineveh, with its known riches, was a prime target. Looters descended upon the mounds under cover of night, digging haphazardly and destructively, not with the careful trowels of archaeologists, but with shovels and backhoes, tearing through ancient layers of history in a frantic search for sellable artifacts to feed the booming international black market in antiquities. These illicit pits and tunnels scarred the landscape, irrevocably destroying the precise context that gives artifacts their scientific meaning and hurling countless unrecorded tablets, pottery shards, and smaller objects into a shadowy underworld, severing them from their history forever. This tragedy reached its horrifying climax with the rise of the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS, which seized control of Mosul and the site of Nineveh in 2014. For these extremists, the ancient past was not a treasure to be looted for profit, but an ideological enemy to be systematically eradicated. They viewed the pre-Islamic civilizations of Mesopotamia as examples of idolatry, their artifacts and monuments as blasphemous idols that had to be purged from the land. In a calculated campaign of cultural cleansing, they turned their weapons not just on people, but on history itself. Using sledgehammers, power drills, and bulldozers, they systematically destroyed the iconic Lamassu and other sculpted reliefs at the site and in the Mosul Museum, filming their acts of vandalism for global propaganda. The colossal winged bulls that had guarded the gates of Nineveh for nearly 3 millennia, which had survived the fire and rage of the Babylonians, were defaced and broken. The militants even used the sacred mound of Nebi Yunus, traditionally believed to be the tomb of the prophet Jonah, as a strategic base, digging extensive tunnels that collapsed, causing immense structural damage and revealing, in a grim irony, previously unknown Assyrian reliefs that were then also destroyed or looted. This was not mere collateral damage from a battle. It was a deliberate, performative annihilation of cultural identity, an attempt to erase any evidence of a rich, diverse history that contradicted their narrow and brutal worldview. This modern devastation creates a profoundly sobering contrast with the 19th century excavations. The actions of Layard and Rassam, which we now rightly question through a post-colonial lens, were at least framed by a narrative of preservation and discovery. They believed, however misguidedly, that they were rescuing a lost civilization from oblivion. The crates sent to London were intended for study and display, to be marveled at and understood. The destruction wrought by ISIS and the looters, however, was driven by nihilism and greed, with no goal other than erasure or profit. One era saw the past as something to be recovered, even if for imperial glory. The other saw it as something to be destroyed for ideological purity or sold off in fragments. This stark juxtaposition forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the survival of our shared human heritage is not guaranteed by its mere discovery. It remains perpetually vulnerable to the political, social, and ideological storms of the present. The same sands that protected the library of Ashurbanipal for 25 centuries could not protect the site from the bulldozers and explosives of the 21st. The aftermath of this destruction has ignited a new, urgent chapter in the story of Nineveh, the fight for its restoration. When the area was finally liberated from ISIS in 2017, archaeologists returned to a scene of heartbreaking devastation. But amidst the rubble, a global effort began to pick up the pieces, both literally and figuratively. International teams working in partnership with Iraqi authorities have embarked on ambitious projects to stabilize the damaged structures, assess the full extent of the loss, and begin the painstaking process of reconstruction. In a powerful symbol of resilience, some of the shattered Lamassu statues are being meticulously reassembled, a complex jigsaw puzzle using both traditional craftsmanship and digital technology. Three-dimensional modeling, created from pre-war photographs and new scans of the fragments, is guiding conservators as they piece the stone guardians back together. This work is more than just physical repair. It is an act of defiance, a statement that the forces of destruction will not have the final word. It is also a crucial part of healing for the local community, for whom these ancient monuments are a source of deep pride and a vital part of their cultural landscape, a connection to a history that long predates the recent nightmares of conflict. The ongoing vulnerability of Nineveh serves as a stark and universal reminder. The preservation of humanity's ancient past is not a task that was completed by Victorian adventurers. it is a fragile, ongoing, and collective struggle. It requires constant vigilance, international cooperation, and a shared commitment to valuing our common history above the transient impulses of conflict, greed, and hatred. The story of this city is a microcosm of human civilization itself, periods of magnificent creation, catastrophic destruction, and tenacious rebirth. The library's tablets, having survived fire, conquest, and centuries of silence, now face the modern threats of environmental decay and ideological fury. Their survival and the survival of the site they came from depends on our continued willingness to act as their guardians. The mounds of Nineveh stand today not just as a monument to a lost empire, but as a testament to the enduring human spirit that seeks to understand its origins, and as a sobering lesson that this precious, irreplaceable connection to who we are is always and forever worth fighting for. While the idea of a king simply wanting to gather knowledge is appealing, the true motives behind Ashurbanipal's library were far more complex and deeply entwined with the very nature of Assyrian power. One of the most compelling theories is that this was not a library in our modern sense of a public institution for learning, but the ultimate administrative and strategic tool for governing a vast multi-ethnic empire. Think of it as the central server for the entire Assyrian state. To rule effectively from his palace in Nineveh, Ashurbanipal needed instant access to a standardized set of protocols. A governor in a distant province facing a rebellion needed to know the correct legal procedures for suppressing it. A priest in a newly conquered city needed to perform rituals exactly as they were done in the heartland to assert Assyrian religious control. A court physician treating the king for a sudden illness couldn't rely on local folklore. He needed the definitive medical text, vetted and approved by the royal court. By centralizing all legal codes, medical handbooks, engineering manuals, and administrative templates, the library became the empire's operational brain. It ensured that the king's will was executed with consistency and authority from the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Iran, making the sprawling, diverse empire manageable from a single, powerful center. This was knowledge as a direct instrument of control, a way to impose a uniform Assyrian identity and system of governance across every territory they subdued. Yet, to attribute the library's creation solely to cold, administrative logic ignores the powerful force of Ashurbanipal's own personality. Here was a king who genuinely prided himself on his intellectual achievements, a ruler who wanted to be remembered not just as a conqueror, but as the most learned man of his age. This points to a second powerful motive, intellectual vanity and the projection of a unique royal image. His inscriptions boast of his literacy, a skill he claimed no prior Assyrian king had ever mastered. Building the world's greatest library was the ultimate flex, a monumental testament to his personal brilliance and his unparalleled power. It was a way of demonstrating that his empire was not merely strong in arms, but preeminent in culture and wisdom. He was, in effect, curating his own legacy. By gathering the literary masterpieces of older civilizations like Babylon, he was positioning himself and Assyria as the rightful heirs and culminators of all Mesopotamian civilization. The library was his personal trophy case, but instead of displaying captured weapons, it displayed captured knowledge, proving that his intellect could subdue and organize the very wisdom of the known world. This was a profound statement of soft power, showing rival kingdoms that Assyria's dominance was cultural and intellectual, not just military. Perhaps the most fascinating theory, however, ventures into the spiritual and supernatural realm. For the Assyrians, the future was not a mystery. It was a text written by the gods in the stars, in the livers of sacrificed sheep, and in the patterns of oil on water. The ability to correctly read these divine signs was the most crucial form of knowledge a king could possess. In this light, Ashurbanipal's library can be seen as a vast arsenal of spiritual weapons. The enormous collections of Omen texts were essentially field manuals for interpreting the will of the gods. By controlling this definitive collection, Ashurbanipal wasn't just collecting interesting data, he was monopolizing the primary channel of communication with the divine. Before launching a military campaign, signing a treaty, or even naming an heir, his priests would consult these tablets. A favorable omen would legitimize his decision, while an unfavorable one could bring everything to a halt. This gave the king and his court scholars immense power, allowing them to sanction any state action with the unquestionable authority of heaven itself. The library was therefore a tool for managing destiny. By gathering all the known omens and rituals, Ashurbanipal was attempting to hedge against uncertainty, to stack the cosmic deck in his favor, and to secure not only his reign but the very survival of his dynasty against the chaotic whims of the gods. It was the ultimate act of royal insurance written on clay. The beauty of this exploration is that we don't have to choose just one of these explanations. The library's true genius and its enduring power lie in the fact that it served all of these purposes at once, each one reinforcing the others. The practical administrative texts kept the empire running smoothly, which provided the economic stability and resources needed to fund the king's grandiose intellectual projects. Those intellectual projects, in turn, bolstered his image as a peerless scholar king, which strengthened his political authority at home and abroad. And that consolidated political authority allowed him to command the religious establishment, using the spiritual knowledge in the Omen texts to legitimize his rule in the eyes of both his people and his gods. The library was a single, brilliantly multi-purpose engine of power. It was at once a practical database, a vanity project, and a holy oracle. Understanding this layered motivation completely transforms our view of the collection. We see that it wasn't just a random assemblage of texts, but a carefully curated weapon designed to project power across every conceivable domain: the earthly, the intellectual, and the divine. Ashurbanipal wasn't just building a repository, he was building the ideological foundation for eternal Assyrian dominance, crafting a legacy where he would be remembered as the king who didn't just conquer the world, but who also managed to understand it, control it, and even, for a fleeting moment, hold its very soul within the walls of his palace. While Ashurbanipal's library stands as a towering achievement, it was not an isolated phenomenon. The powerful urge to gather, organize, and preserve knowledge seems to be a fundamental impulse of complex societies, and across the ancient world, other great centers of learning emerged, each with its own unique character and legacy. To truly appreciate Nineveh's place in history, we need to glance at its most famous successors and contemporaries, understanding what it shared with them, and more importantly, what set it apart. A natural comparison, though from a later period, is the legendary Library of Alexandria in Egypt. Founded in the 3rd century BC under the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, Alexandria represented the next great leap in the concept of a universal library. Its ambition was staggering: to collect all the knowledge of the entire world, focusing on the Greek, Egyptian, and other Mediterranean traditions. Its medium was the papyrus scroll, a technology that was far lighter and more portable than clay tablets, allowing for vast collections to be housed in a single complex connected to the Mauseon, a kind of royal research institute that attracted the greatest minds of the age, from Euclid in geometry to Aristarchus in astronomy. The scale was immense, with estimates of its holdings ranging from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. Yet this very medium was its greatest vulnerability. Papyrus is fragile, susceptible to damp, fire, and simple decay over time. The tragic fate of the Library of Alexandria, gradually declining over centuries through a series of fires and periods of neglect, means that the vast majority of its collection is lost to us forever. Its legacy is one of immense promise and profound loss, a cautionary tale about the fragility of knowledge recorded on perishable materials. Looking closer to home in both time and geography, we find Nineveh's direct rivals and inspirations, the great cuneiform libraries of Babylon and the Hittite capital of Hattusa. Babylon was in many ways the intellectual fountainhead of Mesopotamia. For centuries before Ashurbanipal, its temples and scribble schools were the revered centers of scholarship, producing the foundational texts he so desperately wanted to possess. Babylon had its own significant libraries, but they were often associated with specific temples, like the Ezida temple dedicated to the god Nabu, the patron of scribes. These were centers of ongoing, generative scholarship, where new texts were composed and ancient ones were studied. Ashurbanipal didn't just admire Babylonian learning, he systematically plundered it, sending his scribes to copy and his soldiers to confiscate entire collections to enrich his own library in Nineveh. His actions reveal a key difference. While Babylonian libraries were organic, often decentralized centers of learning, Ashurbanipal's was a centralized, state-sponsored project of intellectual consolidation. Similarly, far to the northwest in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire maintained a royal archive in their capital, Hattusa. This was a truly multilingual collection, preserving texts not only in the Hittite language but also in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the day, and other ancient languages like Hurrian and Luwian. The Hittite library gives us a fascinating glimpse into the international diplomatic and cultural exchanges of the Late Bronze Age. However, its scope was likely more focused on the practical needs of governing the Hittite Empire treaties, legal codes, and religious rituals rather than the encyclopedic, universal ambition that drove the Assyrian king. So, what was the special ingredient, the defining quality that made the library at Nineveh unique in this landscape of ancient knowledge centers? The answer lies in the powerful combination of its systematic methodology and its remarkably durable medium. First, the scale and intent of its collection were unprecedented. This was not an organic growth of texts over time in a temple or school, nor was it solely focused on the traditions of a single culture. Ashurbanipal launched a deliberate, empire-wide dragnet for information. His was a top-down, command-driven project with a clear goal: to bring every significant text from every conquered and allied culture under one royal roof. He sought to create a complete, definitive, and centralized repository, effectively making Nineveh the sole, authoritative archive for the entire Mesopotamian intellectual tradition. This was knowledge collection as an act of imperial policy, a conscious weaponizing of information to solidify control. No other ancient ruler, at least none that we know of from that era, pursued such a comprehensive and systematic gathering of knowledge with such singular focus and resources. The second, and perhaps most fortuitous, factor was the medium itself, the humble clay tablet. While the scholars of Alexandria would later struggle with the fragility of papyrus, and while modern archivists battled the digital obsolescence of file formats, the clay tablets of Nineveh possessed a brute force durability. Inscribed while wet and then hardened, either intentionally or, in the library's case, by the catastrophic fire that destroyed the city, these tablets became virtually indestructible artifacts. They could survive being buried for millennia, resistant to water, pests, and the slow rot that claims organic materials. The fire that should have been their end instead baked them into ceramic, ensuring their survival. This physical resilience is the primary reason we can study the Epic of Gilgamesh, Assyrian medical texts, and royal correspondence today. If Ashurbanipal had collected on papyrus, we would have almost nothing of his great library. Its contents would have turned to dust centuries ago. The clay tablet, heavy and cumbersome as it was, turned out to be the perfect time capsule, preserving the voice of an empire long after its papyrus-based rivals had fallen silent. This comparison ultimately shows us that Nineveh was both a part of a tradition and a revolutionary pioneer. The human desire to collect knowledge is a constant thread running through history, from the temple archives of Babylon to the digital servers of our own time. But Ashurbanipal's library represents a specific, explosive moment when that impulse was fused with the absolute power of a centralized state and executed on a scale never before attempted. It was the first great experiment in creating a universal, state-controlled information system. It stands as a monumental milestone in the history of information science, a proof of concept that organizing vast quantities of knowledge is a source of immense power. While the Library of Alexandria may be more famous in popular imagination, the Library of Nineveh is, in many ways, more foundational. It demonstrated the potential and the perils of centralized knowledge, and thanks to the enduring nature of clay, it left behind a rich and tangible record of its ambition, allowing us to understand not just what the Assyrians knew, but how they thought about the very act of knowing itself. So what lies beneath the untouched parts of those ancient mounds? While the 19th century excavators made the monumental discoveries that defined our understanding of Nineveh, they were essentially mining for masterpieces, digging deep tunnels and trenches to reach the sculptured walls of the royal palaces. Their work was breathtakingly successful, but it was also remarkably limited in scope. The vast majority of the ancient city, an area covering over 1,800 acres, remains completely unexplored by archaeologists. Imagine the sprawling metropolis that was Nineveh at its peak, not just the royal citadel with its palaces and library, but entire districts of administrative buildings, the homes of wealthy merchants and humble artisans, bustling marketplaces, and temples to lesser-known deities. All of this urban landscape is still entombed, a hidden city sleeping just a few feet below the modern surface, waiting for its story to be told. The work of Layard and Rassam was the brilliant first chapter, but the Book of Nineveh is far from complete, with countless pages still firmly sealed within the earth. The key to unlocking these new chapters lies not with the shovels and picks of the past, but with a suite of sophisticated, non-invasive technologies that allow us to see through the ground without ever breaking its surface. Modern archaeology is undergoing a quiet revolution, moving from destructive digging to precise, surgical investigation. One of the most powerful tools in this new arsenal is ground-penetrating radar. Think of it as a medical ultrasound for the Earth. Archaeologists slowly drag a radar unit across the surface, which sends high-frequency radio pulses down into the ground. These pulses bounce back when they hit changes in soil density or man-made structures, creating a detailed three-dimensional map of what lies below. This technology can reveal the ghostly outlines of buried walls, the voids of collapsed rooms, and even the foundations of entire buildings that have left no trace above ground. It allows researchers to map entire city blocks, understanding the urban layout of Nineveh in a way that was impossible for the early excavators, who had to dig almost blindly in the hope of hitting a major structure. Complementing this ground-level view is the God's-eye perspective offered by satellite imagery and aerial photography. Specialized satellites can detect subtle variations in vegetation growth, a phenomenon known as a crop mark. When ancient walls lie just beneath the surface, they stunt the growth of plants above them, creating faint lines of shorter, less healthy vegetation. Conversely, a buried ditch or pit filled with richer soil will promote lusher growth. From space, these patterns form a ghostly blueprint of the ancient city, revealing the street grid, the outlines of houses, and the locations of public squares that are completely invisible from the ground. Furthermore, techniques like Lidar, which uses lasers to map the topography of the ground surface, can detect incredibly subtle rises and dips in the landscape, the barely perceptible mounds that mark the remains of long-collapsed buildings. These tools transform the entire site into a vast, open book, allowing archaeologists to identify the most promising targets for future, limited excavations, ensuring that when they finally do break ground, they do so with the precision of a surgeon, not the brute force of a treasure hunter. With these technological keys in hand, we can begin to speculate about the incredible discoveries that might still be waiting. The most tantalizing possibility is, of course, more libraries. Ashurbanipal's collection was housed in his North Palace, but what about the older, foundational collections assembled by his predecessors? Kings like Sennacherib, who built much of Nineveh's grandeur, or Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal's father, almost certainly maintained their own extensive archives. These could be hidden in other, still buried wings of their palaces, containing different versions of epic poems, unique historical annals, or administrative records that could shed new light on the empire's earlier years. Even more exciting is the potential for finding private archives. The great merchants and scribble families of Nineveh would have kept their own records, business contracts, legal documents, and personal letters. Finding such an archive would be like discovering the private papers of a medieval guild or a Renaissance banking family. It would give us an unprecedented window into the daily economic life, social networks, and personal concerns of the Assyrian elite, moving beyond the royal propaganda of the palace walls to hear the voices of the people who powered the empire's economy. Beyond more tablets, the potential for other kinds of finds is staggering. The tombs of the Assyrian kings have never been conclusively located. While their royal palaces are well known, their final resting places remain one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. Discovering a royal tomb undisturbed by looters would be an event on par with the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt. It could contain not only priceless golden artifacts and royal regalia, but also inscriptions that provide a definitive king list and new details about royal lineage and burial practices. Furthermore, the workshops of the city are still out there waiting to be found. Imagine uncovering the studios where the master sculptors carved the magnificent Lamassu statues and the intricate palace reliefs. Such a discovery could yield unfinished works, tools, and even the scribbles and sketches of the artists themselves, revealing the creative process behind some of the ancient world's most powerful art. We might find the armories where the empire's legendary iron weapons were forged, or the warehouses that held the tribute and trade goods flowing into the capital from every corner of the empire, providing tangible evidence of the vast economic network that Assyria controlled. The story of Nineveh is therefore a narrative in constant evolution, a puzzle where new pieces are still being found, not in the field but in the digital realm and through the steady, patient work of reinterpretation. The ongoing work of joining tablet fragments in museum basements continues to yield new literary works, new historical details, and new understandings of Assyrian science. Every time a scholar makes a new join or a fresh translation, it's as if a new tablet has been discovered. The digital reconstruction of the library is in itself a form of continuous excavation. And as our technology improves, so too does our ability to ask new questions of the old evidence. chemical analysis of the clay in tablets can now sometimes pinpoint the specific region or even the city where the clay was sourced, tracing the movement of scribes and the origins of specific texts. The future of Nineveh is not just about what is still buried, but also about how we choose to listen to the whispers of what we have already found. Each technological leap, from the satellite in orbit to the algorithm analyzing a digital scan, offers a new lens through which to view this ancient capital, ensuring that the conversation between the present and the past never truly ends, and that the sands of this legendary city will continue to capture our imagination for generations to come. And so, the legacy of this first great library is far more than a collection of ancient artifacts. It is a mirror reflecting our own relentless drive to make sense of the world. Those clay tablets from the dust of Mesopotamia are not silent relics. They are a conversation spanning nearly 3,000 years, a direct line to the minds of people who loved, feared, dreamed, and questioned just as we do. In the epic of Gilgamesh's raw grief over his friend Enkidu, we recognize our own struggle with loss and mortality. In the meticulous notes of a physician diagnosing a fever, we see our own pursuit of healing and understanding. In the anxious royal queries to diviners, we feel the universal human desire to peer into the uncertain future. This connection is the library's true gift. It shatters the illusion that the past is a foreign country and reveals the timeless, beating heart of the human experience. It proves that the impulse to write down our stories, to catalog our discoveries, and to preserve our wisdom for those who will come after us is one of the most defining and noble traits of our species. The fire that consumed Nineveh could not burn away this fundamental truth. This legacy challenges us to reconsider what we truly value. In a world often obsessed with material wealth, the Library of Nineveh stands as a monumental testament to a different kind of treasure. The Assyrian Empire was famed for its plunder of gold and silver, its vast territories and magnificent palaces adorned with precious materials. Yet, where is that tangible wealth now? Largely melted down, scattered, or reclaimed by the earth, the treasures that endured, the ones that truly shaped our understanding of history and ourselves, were the words painstakingly inscribed on common, humble clay. The most profound and lasting power resided not in the king's treasury, but in his library. This reminds us that the greatest legacies are often built not from things that glitter, but from ideas that illuminate. The story of Nineveh teaches us that while empires rise and fall on the strength of their armies, their true, enduring influence is measured by the knowledge they create, collect, and leave behind for humanity. Furthermore, the library's journey from a buried ruin to a digitized global resource perfectly encapsulates the unbroken chain of this quest. Ashurbanipal's ambition to centralize all knowledge in one physical location was the ancient seed of an idea that has grown and evolved through the centuries. We see its branches in the great library of Alexandria, in the monastic scriptoria that preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, in the Enlightenment era encyclopedias that sought to compile all human understanding, and in the birth of the modern public library as a pillar of an educated citizenry. Today, that same ambition has exploded into the digital realm with projects like the Internet Archive and the global effort to put the entire library of Nineveh online. Our tools have transformed from stylus and clay to servers and code, but the goal remains strikingly similar: to gather, organize, and make accessible the collective wisdom of our species. The spirit of that Assyrian king lives on in every scientist sharing data, every scholar publishing an open access paper, and every individual who seeks knowledge not for personal gain, but for the greater good. The story is indeed far from over. The physical excavation of Nineveh may be largely complete, but the intellectual excavation of its library continues at an accelerating pace. In museum basements and on computer screens around the world, the great puzzle of broken clay is still being reassembled. Every time a new fragment is digitally matched, a faded sign is enhanced through advanced imaging, or a scholar makes a fresh connection between texts, another voice from the past is recovered. This ongoing work ensures that the library is not a closed book but a living, breathing entity that continues to speak to us. It invites each of us to become explorers, not with shovels but with curiosity. You can now virtually handle these tablets from your own home, read the translations of letters sent between kings, or marvel at the sophistication of ancient medical practices. The Library of Nineveh beckons us to look beyond the dates and dynasties and to connect with the people behind the artifacts, to see their humanity reflected in our own, and to carry forward the timeless, essential work of adding to the great, unfolding story of human knowledge. If this journey into the heart of the world's first library has captivated your imagination as much as it has ours, the adventure doesn't have to end here. You can become a digital explorer yourself from the comfort of your own home. Institutions like the British Museum have undertaken incredible projects to put high-resolution images and detailed information about these very clay tablets online, allowing you to examine the intricate cuneiform writing and follow the work of scholars as they piece together this ancient puzzle. It's a breathtaking opportunity to look directly at the same artifacts we've been discussing, to see the cracks, the fingerprints of the scribes, and the careful impressions of their styluses, all without a plane ticket or a glass display case between you and history. This is your chance to walk the virtual halls of Ashurbanipal's collection and see the evidence of this story with your own eyes. Now, we'd love to hear from you and bring your curiosity into our community. Down in the comments, tell us about the ancient mystery that most captures your imagination. Is it the fate of the lost tomb of Alexander the Great, the purpose of the sprawling Nazca lines in Peru, or the secrets still hidden within the unexcavated chambers of the Great Pyramid? Maybe you're fascinated by the undeciphered script of the Indus Valley civilization, or the true story behind the legend of Atlantis. Sharing your thoughts helps us all discover new stories and connects us through our shared wonder about the vast, unexplored chapters of our human past. Your question might just inspire the topic for our next deep dive together. To make sure you're with us for that next adventure, be sure to subscribe to the channel and tap that notification bell. We're constantly delving into the shadows of history, unearthing stories of forgotten empires, enigmatic artifacts, and the incredible people who dedicated their lives to solving history's greatest puzzles. From the depths of the ocean to the heart of the jungle, we're committed to bringing you the most compelling narratives of discovery and mystery, all delivered with the same depth and detail you experienced today. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible exploration of the secrets beneath the sands of Nineveh. Your passion for the past is what keeps these stories alive. Until next time.